Welcome to Quiet Chronicles. Settle in and allow the heaviness of attention to loosen its hold as the day's unfinished thoughts begin to lose their shape and the mind no longer has to gather every concern, every memory, and every small tomorrow waiting at the edge of sleep. Quiet Chronicles publishes weekly, and if these histories are serving you, you are warmly invited to subscribe. A gentle like also helps the channel continue offering calm, careful journeys into the past. This is a journey into the entire story of the Anunnaki, the ancient gods of mystery and creation, through the river plains of Mesopotamia, the temples of Sumer, the old cities of Uruk, Eridu, Nippur, and Babylon, and the clay tablets that carried divine names across thousands of years. It moves through creation, kingship, labor, judgment, the underworld, and the long survival of stories once pressed into damp clay by careful hands. Close your eyes, if they are not already closed, and let the history begin. Chapter 1. Between the two rivers, before the gods had written names. Southern Mesopotamia lay in the low country between the Tigris and the Euphrates, where the rivers moved toward the Gulf through a plain made not from stone hills or deep forests, but from silt, water, reed beds, and the patient work of irrigation. Long before the Anunnaki were named in the surviving tablets, this landscape had already shaped the habits of the people who lived there. The land offered abundance, but it rarely offered it without labor, and the earliest communities learned to read the rivers as both gift and obligation. The southern plain did not resemble the mountain valleys from which some of its later building stone and timber would come. It was broad, flat, and changeable, with channels that shifted, marshes that spread and receded, and fields that depended on the careful management of water. In such a place, settlement was not only a matter of choosing land and remaining there, because the land itself had to be maintained through canals, embankments, clearing, planting, and repair. During the Ubaid period, which stretched across much of the 6th and 5th millennia BCE, village life in southern Mesopotamia began to take on forms that later generations would recognize as ancient even in their own time. Communities raised mud brick buildings, shaped painted pottery, kept animals, cultivated grain, and participated in networks of exchange that reached beyond the immediate plain. These were not yet the great cities of later Sumer, but they held the beginnings of the social habits from which the cities would grow. Eridu became one of the oldest names in this remembered world. Later Mesopotamian tradition treated Eridu as a city of great antiquity, a place linked closely with Enki, Lord of Wisdom, fresh water, craft, and the deep underground waters that the Sumerians called the Abzu. The earliest temple levels at Eridu belonged to a long sequence of rebuilding where one sacred structure was raised over the remains of another, and this habit of rebuilding gave the site a depth that later imagination could easily understand as sacred age. The temple was not yet the vast institution it would become in the 3rd millennium BCE, but even in these earlier centuries, public sacred buildings drew attention toward a center. A shrine gathered offerings, labor, memory, and authority into one place, and each act of rebuilding suggested that the place itself mattered beyond the lives of the people who used it. Over time, the god was not merely honored in the settlement, but became part of the settlement's identity, as though city and deity had slowly grown around the same enduring core. Farther north within the southern alluvium, the settlement that became Uruk began to expand during the 4th millennium BCE. The Uruk period brought larger populations, more complex administration, wider trade, and new forms of public architecture. In later memory, Uruk would be associated with Inanna, with kingship, with heroic tales, and with the deep prestige of early urban life. But at its beginning, it was one of the places where the habits of village, shrine, storehouse, and workshop gathered into something larger. The growth of Uruk was not a single event, and it did not require later people to imagine a sudden founding moment. Its development rested on accumulation. More fields drawn into cultivation, more labor coordinated by officials, more goods measured and stored, more ritual occasions repeated, and more people living close enough together to need durable systems of order. Mud brick walls, temple platforms, courtyards, and storerooms gave this order a visible form, while the movement of grain, wool, oil, and animals gave it a daily rhythm. In this world, the divine was not separated from practical life. A god could own land, receive grain, hold herds, command workers through the temple household, and stand behind the legitimacy of those who organized the city. The sacred and the administrative did not occupy two distant realms, because offerings had to be counted, fields had to be assigned, festivals had to be prepared, and buildings had to be repaired after sun, rain, and river damp had done their slow work. Nippur, though never the largest political capital in the same simple sense as some other cities, came to hold an importance that later Mesopotamians understood through Enlil. Enlil's temple, the Ekkad, would become one of the central religious institutions of Sumer, and kings from different cities sought legitimacy through their relationship to that sacred center. Before that later prominence was fully formed, the broader pattern was already emerging, in which a city could matter because its god mattered, and a god could matter because generations of rulers, priests, and scribes treated the place as a center of cosmic authority. Ur also belonged to this early southern world, close to waterways that connected inland fields with marshland, Gulf trade, and distant sources of material. Later centuries would make Ur famous for its royal tombs, its moon god Nana, and its great ziggurat. But its deeper significance rested in the same pattern of settlement, cult, labor, and memory. A city survived not only because people lived there, but because it became woven into stories of divine favor, ancestral custom, and the proper arrangement of the world. The gods who would later stand near the Anunnaki did not first appear as a complete and orderly pantheon. Their names, powers, and relationships gathered over time from local cults, older traditions, ritual habits, and the changing political importance of the cities that honored them. An would be remembered as the high god of heaven, Enki as the wise power of deep fresh water, Enlil as the lord whose authority shaped kingship and fate, and Inanna as a force of love, power, and sovereignty. But the relationships among them were never as fixed as a later handbook might suggest. The word Anunna, and later the Akkadian form Anunnaki, belonged to this layered world of divine kinship and rank. In some traditions, they were understood as the offspring or descendants of An, and in others they appeared as a group of senior gods, divine judges, or powers associated with heaven, earth, and the underworld. Their meaning changed across time, but the conditions that made such a group imaginable were already present in early Mesopotamia, where authority was thought of in councils, households, offices, and ordered ranks. Human society in the southern cities gave divine society much of its language. The temple had dependents, officials, storerooms, lands, and obligations, and the city had rulers who served gods while also commanding people. It was natural, within such a world, to imagine the gods themselves as belonging to an ordered assembly with high figures, specialized powers, inherited claims, and decisions that shaped the fate of cities and kings. This was one reason the earliest Mesopotamian gods remained so closely tied to place. Enki did not float free from Eridu. Inanna did not lose her connection with Uruk. Enlil's authority could not be separated from Nippur, and Nana's later importance rested heavily in Ur. Each city gave its god a house, a staff of servants, a calendar of offerings, and a visible body of architecture, and each god gave the city a place in a cosmos that extended beyond the fields and canals immediately around it. By the late 4th millennium BCE, administration had become complex enough that older systems of memory were no longer sufficient. Tokens, sealings, marks, and impress signs developed in relation to accounting, storage, and obligation. And from these practical needs, writing would emerge. The first written signs were not composed to preserve long myths of the Anunnaki, but they belonged to the same temple-centered world that would later preserve divine names, offerings, hymns, and stories. The beginning of writing did not create the gods, but it changed their afterlife. A spoken name could pass through ritual and memory for generations, yet a written name could lie on clay, survive the death of a priest, and be copied by a student in a city far from the god's earliest home. This mattered for the Anunnaki because their later history depends on the survival of names and categories across languages, dynasties, and schools. The rivers continued to define the plain beneath all of this. They carried water to fields, supported reeds for building and writing, connected cities through channels and marshes, and sometimes altered the pattern of settlement when their courses changed. The people of early southern Mesopotamia did not live against the rivers so much as within their demands, and the gods they honored belonged to a world where water, labor, order, and dependence were never far apart. By the time the first cities of Sumer had taken recognizable shape, the foundation of the Anunnaki's story had been laid without needing one single mythic beginning. There were cities with gods, temples with estates, rulers with sacred duties, workers with measured obligations, and scribes beginning to preserve names in clay. The divine world that later texts would describe as ancient had grown from this slow arrangement of place, labor, water, and memory, and it rested in the plain between the two rivers, where the earliest gods of Sumer settled into their houses and remained. Chapter 2: Clay, Reed, and the First Lists of Heaven. Clay was the first great keeper of Mesopotamian memory, not because it seemed noble in itself, but because it lay everywhere in the southern plain and accepted the pressure of human hands. It could be dug from riverbanks, mixed with water, shaped into tablets, sealed around cords, pressed with signs, and left to dry until a passing record became a durable object. Before long stories of the Anunnaki were written down, before the divine assemblies of later myth were copied in schoolrooms, clay had already begun to hold the practical order of the cities. The earliest marks were bound to administration. Temples and households needed to remember how much grain had entered a storehouse, how many animals belonged to an estate, how much wool had been assigned, and which workers had received rations. These needs did not feel separate from religion, because the estates being counted often belonged to gods, and the goods moving through them were part of the daily service owed to divine houses. A reed stylus made the system possible in a form suited to the land. Reeds grew in the marshes and along the waterways, and when a stem was cut and shaped, its end could press small wedges and lines into damp clay. The hand did not draw in the later sense, but pressed, turned, and lifted, leaving signs that had depth as well as shape, and these impressions made writing part of the same world as irrigation cuts, seal marks, brick molds, and the measured handling of earth. Cuneiform was not born as literature. Its early forms belonged to counting, labeling, and organizing, and only slowly did the script become capable of preserving hymns, myths, royal inscriptions, laments, prayers, and learned commentaries. This slow beginning matters because Mesopotamian religion did not enter writing first as a complete sacred book, but as names, offerings, divine possessions, temple labor, and lists of things that had to be placed in proper order. Lists were among the oldest habits of scribal thought. Scribes arranged signs, objects, professions, animals, cities, and divine names into sequences that could be taught, copied, corrected, and remembered. A list may seem plain beside a myth of creation or descent, yet in Mesopotamia the act of listing carried a quiet intellectual weight, because to name things in order was to make the world manageable, teachable, and continuous. The first divine names preserved in writing were therefore not surrounded by the full richness that later mythology would give them. They appeared as entries, recipients, owners, or powers attached to offerings and places. A god's name on a tablet might stand near measures of grain, jars of oil, animals, workers, or land. And this closeness between divine name and material account shows how sacred presence was woven into the economic body of the city. The Anunnaki, as later readers meet them, belong to a more developed theological language than the earliest accounting tablets provide. Yet the early habit of preserving divine names in clay prepared the world in which a category such as Anunna or Anunnaki could endure. Once a name could be copied, compared, translated, placed in a list, and carried from one scribal generation to another, it could live a longer life than any one temple official or singer of hymns. Cylinder seals belong to this same world of memory and order. A small carved stone, rolled across wet clay, could leave a continuous image that marked ownership, authority, or approval. The seal was practical because it secured jars, doors, tablets, and bundles, but it also carried scenes of ritual, animals, divine symbols, and human figures approaching powers greater than themselves. Such seals show that early Mesopotamian religion was not preserved only by words. It survived also through repeated gestures, sealing a container, presenting an offering, standing before a divine emblem, carrying goods into a temple court, and marking a transaction with an image that others could recognize. These acts gave divine authority a physical trace, and the trace remained even after the people who made it had passed out of memory. Votive objects carried another kind of record. Figures with folded hands, bowls dedicated to gods, carved vessels, and small offerings placed within sacred spaces expressed a relationship between human communities and divine powers. They did not tell a myth in the long literary sense, but they recorded the posture of devotion, the presence of a giver, and the expectation that the god's house was a place where gifts might remain. The Warka vase, associated with Uruk, belongs to this wider world of offering and procession. Its carved registers show ordered movement through plants, animals, human bearers, and divine presence. And although scholars discuss its details with care, its general meaning rests in the relation between abundance and the goddess's house. Grain, animals, vessels, and people appear not as scattered things, but as parts of a sacred economy moving toward the divine. This sacred economy shaped how later Mesopotamians could imagine the gods. Divine life was not pictured only as distant brightness or invisible rule, because the gods had houses, meals, attendants, storerooms, ornaments, symbols, and festivals. The same city that counted sheep and barley for a temple could also imagine a divine assembly in which rank, function, inheritance, and decision mattered deeply. The movement from object to myth was therefore gradual. A sealed jar, a ration tablet, a votive figure, and a list of divine names may seem far from the great stories of Enki, Enlil, Inanna, Ereshkigal, or the Anunnaki as judges of fate. Yet the later stories depended on the same scribal and ritual culture, because myths could be preserved only where signs were taught, tablets were stored, and divine names were treated as worthy of careful repetition. Scribal training gave this repetition a human setting. Young students learned signs by copying models, first in simple exercises and later in longer compositions. They pressed wedges into clay again and again, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with increasing skill. And through that discipline, they entered a chain of memory that carried older words into later centuries. The schoolroom was not separate from the temple and palace world that supported it. It trained the people who could account for offerings, record legal decisions, copy hymns, preserve royal names, and transmit stories about the gods. A divine name written by a student was both an exercise and an act of continuity, because the student's hand renewed a sign that might already have been ancient. As writing developed, the gods became more portable without becoming detached from place. Enki still belonged especially to Eridu, Inanna to Uruk, Enlil to Nippur, and Nanna to Ur, but their names could travel through tablets, lists, hymns, and learned tradition. A city's god could be known in another city's school, and a local cult could enter a wider system of divine relationships. This portability helped create the layered quality of Mesopotamian theology. A god could have an old Sumerian name, an Akkadian counterpart or title, a local cult center, a place in a genealogy, a role in a myth, and an entry in a scholarly list. The Anunnaki would later inhabit this layered system, sometimes as the great gods collectively, sometimes as underworld judges, sometimes as ancient divine powers whose precise number and membership shifted from text to text. The clay tablets did not remove uncertainty, they preserved it. Because Mesopotamian scribes copied traditions from different places and periods, the surviving record does not give one single arrangement of the gods, but many arrangements resting beside one another. This is part of the historical character of the Anunnaki, whose story was never fixed in one final form, but remained a long accumulation of names, offices, myths, and scholarly habits. Even broken tablets matter in such a history. A fragment may hold only a few signs, a divine name, a measure of grain, or part of a line from a myth, yet it still belongs to the larger survival of the ancient world. The incompleteness itself is gentle evidence of how the past reached the present, not as a single perfect inheritance, but as many hardened pieces carried through ruin, burial, copying, and recovery. By the time longer mythological compositions were being written and copied, the material foundation had already been laid. Clay had held accounts, seals had marked authority, votive objects had remained in sacred spaces, and lists had trained scribes to imagine order through names. The Anunnaki would come to be remembered through stories of heaven, earth, creation, labor, judgment, and the underworld. But their survival began in the quieter discipline of clay and reed, where the first signs of divine memory settled into the surface and remained. Chapter 3: The Temple Household and the Labor of the Gods. The temple household gave Mesopotamian religion its daily shape, because a god in Sumer was not only a name spoken in reverence or a power imagined above the city, but the owner of land, animals, buildings, tools, workers, and stored abundance. The god had a house, and the house had doors, courtyards, kitchens, storerooms, fields, herds, vessels, accounts, and people whose labor kept the sacred estate in motion. In this way, divine presence entered ordinary time through bread, beer, wool, grain, oil, clay tablets, and the repeated care of things that had to be measured and renewed. This household was not a small or private household in the later domestic sense. It was an institution large enough to gather the produce of fields, the work of dependents, the attention of scribes, and the authority of rulers into one organized body. The temple received offerings, but it also redistributed goods, employed labor, stored harvests, maintained workshops, sponsored rituals, and held a place at the center of the city's economic and ceremonial life. In Uruk, the Anna precinct was associated above all with Inanna, whose later mythology would carry her through love, power, kingship, battle, descent, and return. Yet before these stories reached their fuller literary forms, her house already stood within a civic world where the goddess's presence was made visible through buildings, offerings, and processions. A temple precinct could hold open courts, raised platforms, storerooms, and decorated spaces, and each part of the complex belonged to the larger idea that the divine had settled in the city and accepted service from its people. At Eridu, the ancient home of Enki carried a different sacred weight. Enki's link with the Abzu, the deep fresh waters beneath the earth, gave his cult a connection to wisdom, fertility, purification, and the hidden sources that made life possible in a dry and irrigated land. The repeated rebuilding of his shrine over many centuries suggested continuity rather than sudden invention, and later Mesopotamians could look back toward Eridu as though divine order had begun there in a time already distant beyond easy measure. Nippur held another kind of authority through Enlil and the Eker, the temple whose name could be understood as the mountain house. In the flat southern plain, the idea of a sacred mountain carried a force that architecture and theology could share, because a raised temple platform gave height to a land of low horizons. Enlil's cult became central to kingship, and rulers who wished to appear legitimate did not merely conquer or govern, but sought recognition within the sacred geography that Nippur represented. The offices of ruler and temple servant were closely joined in this world. The Sumerian Insi could be understood as a city ruler, often with a strong sense of stewardship under the city's god, while the Lugal, the great man or king, came to carry wider political weight in many contexts. These titles did not belong to a single unchanging constitutional order, but they show how leadership developed within a field of sacred duty, local authority, military need, labor organization, and the continuing claim that the gods stood behind rightful rule. A ruler's task was therefore not only to command people. He repaired canals, built or restored temples, dedicated objects, offered goods, protected fields, settled disputes, sponsored festivals, and presented his reign as a period in which the gods' houses were properly maintained. When later inscriptions praised kings for building temples, the praise was not ornamental, because building was one of the clearest signs that a ruler had placed human labor in the service of divine order. The temple estate required many kinds of work. Shepherds tended animals that could provide wool, milk, hides, or offerings. Brewers prepared beer. Millers ground grain. Bakers made bread. Weavers turned wool into cloth. Carpenters and metalworkers supplied useful and ceremonial objects, and scribes recorded the movement of goods through accounts that preserved the memory of obligation. The god's household was therefore filled with human hands, though the wealth was described as belonging to the divine owner whose name gave the institution its meaning. Rations were part of this structure. Workers could receive measured amounts of barley, oil, wool, or beer, and the tablet that recorded such distributions belonged to a world in which labor and sustenance were carefully connected. A ration list may seem distant from myth, but it reveals one of the deepest assumptions of Mesopotamian religion, that human beings lived within a system of service, maintenance, and return, where the gods received care and the city received order. Festivals altered the rhythm of this daily administration. At certain times, divine images could be clothed, fed, carried, honored, visited, or joined with other divine powers through ritual movement. The city changed during such observances, not because ordinary life disappeared, but because ordinary labor rose into ceremonial form, and food, textiles, music, procession, and offering gathered around the god's presence. The divine image itself was treated as more than a representation. In Mesopotamian practice, a properly consecrated cult statue could receive food, clothing, washing, adornment, and ritual attention, and through these acts the god's presence was made active in the temple. The materials of the statue, whether wood, metal, stone, precious inlay, or fine garment, mattered because divine care was expressed through the finest things a city could gather and protect. This care required priestly and administrative knowledge. Different temple personnel had different duties, and although the exact titles and functions changed across period and place, the larger pattern remained clear enough. Some served in ritual roles, some managed goods, some kept accounts, some prepared offerings, some tended sacred spaces, and some preserved the chants, prayers, and procedures by which the city approached its gods. The world of the temple also helped shape the Mesopotamian idea of a divine assembly. Human institutions had ranks, offices, senior figures, dependents, messengers, and formal decisions, and the gods were imagined through comparable structures without being reduced to them. The Anunnaki could be understood as a high order of divine beings, gathered around authority, judgment, inheritance, and cosmic rank, because the cities themselves knew how power gathered in councils, households, and courts. This connection between human order and divine order did not make the gods simple reflections of society. Rather, it allowed society to understand itself as part of a larger arrangement. When a ruler claimed divine favor, when a temple received offerings, when a scribe entered goods on a tablet, and when a festival renewed the god's presence in the city, each act confirmed that human life was held inside a structure older and higher than any single generation. The temple household also made divine time feel continuous. Fields were planted and harvested, animals were counted, bricks were replaced, offerings were prepared, and festivals returned with the calendar. Nothing depended on one moment of revelation alone, because the god's house was maintained through repetition, and repetition gave sacred order a steady weight. For the later stories of the Anunnaki, this matters greatly. Myths of creation, divine labor, and human service did not arise in a world where gods were distant from work. They arose in cities where work already belonged to the gods, where humans ground grain, brewed beer, wove cloth, and dug canals under institutions that presented such labor as part of the proper order of existence. The temple economy also explains why Mesopotamian creation stories could speak so plainly about service. In later compositions such as Atrocis, human beings were created to take up labor that had burdened lesser gods, and this idea may sound severe to modern ears. Yet within the older Mesopotamian setting, labor was not merely hardship, because it was also the means by which cities, temples, fields, and offerings continued from season to season. The gods were fed in ritual language, though not because divine beings depended on food in the ordinary human sense. Offerings expressed relationship, obligation, rank, and continuity. Bread, beer, dates, meat, oil, and incense moved into the temple system as signs that the city remembered its gods, and the redistribution of goods through temple and palace linked sacred honor with the practical maintenance of society. As cities became larger and political life more complex, the temple did not remain the only center of power. Palaces grew in importance. Kings gathered wider authority. Armies and taxation expanded, and administrative systems reached beyond the sacred precinct. Yet the older temple model continued to shape the language of legitimacy, because even the strongest ruler needed to show that his power rested within divine order rather than merely upon human force. This balance between temple and palace varied from city to city and century to century. In some periods, temple institutions held enormous economic influence, while in others, royal authority drew more resources into palace administration. The distinction was never a clean division between religion and government, because both temple and palace used scribes, labor, storage, ritual, and claims of rightful order to hold the city together. The Anunnaki belonged to the imagination of such a world. They were not worshipped in one simple form across all places and periods, and they were not always the main named gods of a given local cult. Yet, as a category of senior divine powers, they made sense in a civilization that understood authority through households, ranked offices, assemblies, inheritance, decrees, and the ordering of labor. In the temple household, the sacred was not separated from the weight of grain in a basket or the number of sheep in an account. The divine passed through stored barley, folded wool, poured oil, brewed beer, and the smooth face of a tablet before it received signs. This material closeness gave Mesopotamian religion its unusual density, because the gods were present not only in hymns and myths, but in the durable routines by which a city remained alive. By the time Sumerian cities reached their mature form, the temple household had become one of the great foundations of Mesopotamian civilization. It taught people to imagine the gods as owners, rulers, recipients, judges, and members of an ordered society beyond the human one. It prepared the language in which the Anunnaki could later appear as high powers of assembly and fate, resting above and beneath the world that humans maintain through labor, offering, record, and return. Chapter 4: Enlil, Enki, and the High Assembly. And stood at the height of the Mesopotamian divine order, a god whose name meant heaven, and whose authority belonged to the uppermost reach of the cosmos. In later lists and theological arrangements, he often appeared as the remote father of gods, the source from which divine rank and inheritance could be imagined to descend. Yet his greatness was not always the same as active rule, because Mesopotamian religion allowed a god to be supreme in ancestry and dignity, while another god carried more immediate authority in the life of cities, kings, and ritual decisions. This difference between height and rule mattered for the world in which the Anunnaki took shape. If the name Anunnaki could be understood as those of An's line, or as the princely gods connected with his ancient authority, then An gave them a place in the language of divine descent. He was less often the god whose daily cult organized the political life of later Sumer, but his name remained a summit, a point of reference from which other powers could be ranked and remembered. Enlil stood closer to the working authority of Sumerian civilization. His great cult center was Nippur, and his temple, the Ekkor, held a position that made Nippur sacred beyond the ordinary power of any one city-state. Kings sought legitimacy through Enlil because his favor could present rule not as local success alone, but as something recognized by the ordering power of the land. The Ekkor was remembered as a mountain house, and in the flatness of southern Mesopotamia, that name carried more than architectural description. It suggested height, stability, and divine command set within a country of mud brick, reed, canal, and river plain. Enlil's authority gathered around the decreeing of destinies, the granting of kingship, and the ordering of the world in ways that made him central to theology, politics, and the imagination of lawful power. Beside Enlil stood Enki, whose oldest home was Eridu, and whose nature belonged to wisdom, skill, fresh water, craft, purification, and the deep source of life beneath the earth. Enki did not carry authority in the same register as Enlil. He often appeared as the god who understood hidden things, solved difficulties, protected life through intelligence, and made possible the arts by which civilization continued. The waters associated with Enki were not the salt waters of the open sea, but the life-giving fresh waters of the Abzu, the deep reservoir imagined beneath the earth. In a land where irrigation determined settlement and where fields depended upon water guided by human labor, this association gave Enki a quiet and durable importance. Wisdom, in his world, was not only the thought of a distant mind, but the knowledge that allowed canals to function, crafts to develop, rituals to be performed, and cities to remain in order. The relationship between Enlil and Enki gave Mesopotamian theology one of its steady balances. Enlil represented command, rank, decree, and the authority that established rule. Enki represented intelligence, making, adaptation, and the skill that could preserve life when rule alone was not enough. Later myths often used this balance to explain why divine decisions unfolded through both command and counsel, through the weight of assembly and the softer movement of cunning aid. Ninhursag, whose name could be rendered as Lady of the Mountain, belonged among the great motherly and birth-giving powers of Sumerian religion. Her identities and associations overlapped with other goddesses across time, as Mesopotamian divine figures often did, but she remained connected with fertility, the formation of life, the earth, and the generative powers through which gods and humans could be imagined as coming into being. In traditions where creation required shaping, birth, and divine planning, her presence stood near the sources of embodied life. Ki, the earth, appears in some theological arrangements as the counterpart of An, and the union or separation of heaven and earth belonged to one of the deep structures through which Mesopotamians imagined the cosmos. The details varied, and the surviving traditions do not give one uniform system that remained unchanged across all centuries. What remained steady was the habit of understanding the world through ordered powers, each with a place, a genealogy, and a set of relations that allowed the cosmos to be narrated as a family and a hierarchy. Utu, the sun god, carried the light by which justice could be imagined. His daily passage across the sky made him a witness, and his association with judgment gave him a moral and legal importance in the life of human beings. In later Akkadian tradition, he was known as Shamash, and under that name his connection with justice became one of the clearest divine principles in Mesopotamian law and royal ideology. Nana, the moon god, had his great center at and his cycles gave time a visible rhythm. The moon governed months, calendars, omens, and the measured return of nights and festivals. In a civilization that watched the sky with care and tied ritual time to celestial movement, Nana's presence was not distant decoration, but part of the regular structure through which divine order could be read above the city. Inanna, later closely identified with Akkadian Ishtar, moved across categories with unusual force. She belonged to love, sexuality, sovereignty, conflict, the planet Venus, and the dangerous crossing of boundaries. Her cult at Uruk was ancient and prestigious, and her myths preserved a goddess who could receive the powers of civilization, descend to the underworld, raise and unsettle kings, and stand at the edge where attraction, rule, and disorder met. The divine world that held Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Utu, Nana, Inanna, and many others was not a neat diagram made once and left unchanged. It was a layered inheritance. Gods had Sumerian names, Akkadian names, local titles, family relations, city homes, cult images, specialized powers, and roles in stories that did not always agree with one another in every detail. This was not failure in the Mesopotamian mind. A god could be understood through several traditions at once because the past was cumulative. Older city cults did not vanish when a wider theology developed, and a divine genealogy could preserve one pattern while a myth from another place preserved another. The scribes who copied such materials did not always need to smooth them into one final arrangement, because the weight of antiquity itself gave authority to inherited variation. Within this layered divine society, the Anunna or Anunnaki appear as a group rather than as one single god. In Sumerian usage, the Anunna could be associated with the great gods, and in Akkadian the form Anunnaki became familiar in texts that placed them among senior divine powers. Their number, membership, and exact function shifted according to period and composition, but they often carried the sense of an older, higher, or more solemn divine order. In some traditions, they were linked to An by descent, as though their rank came from the high heaven god whose name stood at the beginning of divine ancestry. In others, they appeared in relation to the assembly of gods, where decisions about fate, kingship, creation, punishment, and cosmic arrangement could be made. At times they belonged to the upper world of great divine authority, and at other times they appeared as judges in the underworld, seated powers before whom even gods could be brought into order. The idea of a divine assembly was deeply suited to Mesopotamian civilization. Human cities had councils, elders, rulers, temple officials, scribes, judges, labor overseers, and formal procedures by which authority took shape. It was natural for the divine world to be imagined as a greater version of ordered society, where senior gods conferred, decreed, assigned offices, and fixed the destinies that human beings experienced as the conditions of life. Fate in this world was not a vague feeling. It could be decreed, held, assigned, or confirmed by powers greater than human will. The tablets of destiny, the language of decree, and the authority of divine counsel all belonged to a religious imagination in which order was not merely present, but actively maintained through decisions made beyond the visible world. The Anunnaki's importance rests partly in this solemn collective quality. A single god could have vivid stories, local rites, and recognizable attributes, but the Anunnaki often represented rank itself, the gathered weight of divine authority. They could stand behind mythic events not as one character among others, but as the council, the judges, the senior powers whose presence made a decision binding. This collective nature also explains why the Anunnaki were never confined to one simple role. In creation traditions, they might appear as the senior gods for whom labor and service mattered. In underworld traditions, they might sit as judges. In god lists and theological arrangements, they might occupy the high company of ancient divine beings. Their meaning depended on context, and their endurance came from the ability to inhabit several layers of Mesopotamian thought without losing their older dignity. The divine family also changed as political history changed. When cities rose or faded, their gods could gain or lose prominence. When Akkadian language spread through administration and literature, Sumerian gods received Akkadian names or counterparts. When Babylon later rose in prestige, Marduk would be elevated within inherited structures of divine authority, and older patterns would be rearranged without being wholly removed. This capacity for rearrangement was one of the great strengths of Mesopotamian religion. It allowed ancient gods to remain present even when the political world around them had altered. A god could be reinterpreted, paired with another, placed in a new genealogy, honored through an older hymn, or preserved in a school text long after the original balance of city power had shifted. The Anunnaki belonged especially well to such a religious world because they were not dependent on one image or one city alone. They were a category of power, a name for a divine order whose outlines could be adjusted as theology, empire, language, and myth changed. Their antiquity made them useful to later scribes, because a reference to the Anunnaki could carry the weight of an older world without requiring every member of the group to be named. Yet the older gods remained rooted in place. An's high heaven, Enlil's Nippur, Enki's Eridu, Inanna's Uruk, Nana's and Utu's association with justice and sunlight all gave the pantheon a geography as well as a genealogy. The divine assembly was not imagined in empty space because every major god carried the memory of a city, a temple, a cult image, a set of offerings, and a body of stories. The result was a theology both ordered and fluid. It had high gods and local gods, assemblies and households, cosmic regions and city shrines, inherited names and new arrangements. It could speak of heaven, earth, fresh water, the underworld, kingship, fertility, justice, and craft, while allowing the relationships among these powers to remain spacious enough for many traditions to survive. For the listener of ancient Mesopotamian history, this means that the Anunnaki should not be searched for as though they were a fixed list of characters from one closed book. They belonged instead to a living archive of cult, myth, administration, hymn, and scholarly ordering. They were most fully themselves when seen as part of the broad divine society that Mesopotamia carried through its cities and tablets. In that society, An gave height, Enlil gave command, Enki gave wisdom, Ninhursag gave generative depth, Utu gave justice, Nana gave measured time, and Inanna gave the force of power crossing boundaries. Around and among them, the Anunnaki gathered as the Great Ones, the Ancient Ones, the Judges, the Assembly, the senior divine powers whose names settled into the long memory of Sumer and Akkad. Their story was not a single myth beginning in one place, but a slow arrangement of divine rank and sacred relation, held together by cities that treated the gods as present, powerful, and old beyond ordinary memory. Chapter 5. In the Age of Rival Cities. Between roughly 2900 and 2300 BCE, the cities of Sumer entered the period that modern historians call early dynastic, and the divine world of southern Mesopotamia became more visible through inscriptions, monuments, temples, and the claims of rulers. The old foundations of settlement had already been laid, and the gods had already taken their places in the houses and calendars of the cities. What changed in this age was the density of political memory, because rival cities now left clearer signs of how they understood land, rule, justice, boundary, and divine favor. The plain between the Tigris and Euphrates did not become a single kingdom in a simple or lasting way during these centuries. It remained a landscape of cities and their dependent fields, with canals linking settlements and also marking the places where interests could meet uneasily. Uruk, Ur, Kish, Lagash, Umma, Nippur, and other centers each carried their own sacred weight, and each understood itself through the god or gods whose houses stood within its walls. The rivalry between cities was not only a struggle for prestige. It often concerned fields, water rights, canal access, labor, and the control of land that had been cultivated over generations. Because agriculture depended on irrigation, and irrigation depended on maintenance across distances, the boundary between two city territories could become a matter of survival, income, ritual obligation, and royal honor. A disputed field was never merely soil when it belonged to a god's estate, supported a temple's offerings, and fed the workers whose rations were entered on clay. Lagash and Umma became the best-known example of this pattern. Their long dispute over the fertile Guadina, a borderland claimed between them, entered written memory because the rulers of Lagash described the matter in inscriptions that placed local conflict within divine order. In those accounts, Ningirsu, the patron god of Lagash, stood behind the city's claims, and the struggle over territory became a matter judged and witnessed by gods as much as negotiated by men. Eannatum of Lagash, who ruled in the early dynastic period, left one of the most famous monuments of this age, the Stele of the Vultures. Its carved scenes and inscription present Lagash's victory over Umma under the authority of Ningirsu, and the monument shows how political events were framed as acts within a sacred and legal world. The violence itself need not be lingered over to understand the monument's meaning, because its deeper importance lies in the way it joined ruler, city, god, boundary, oath, and memory into a single public statement. The Stele of the Vultures was not only a record of conflict, it was also a record of order restored according to the claims of Lagash. A boundary had been violated, a god's territory had been defended, and a ruler presented himself as the one through whom divine justice returned to the land. The stone made the event durable, while the inscription placed human rivalry inside the larger framework of divine ownership and judgment. Ningirsu's role in this history shows how local gods could carry great power without belonging to the most universal level of the pantheon. He was especially tied to Lagash and its territory, and his authority mattered deeply in the city's inscriptions. The Anunnaki, by contrast, were not always the named center of such local political records, but the idea of a divine order composed of senior powers, judging gods, and decreeing authorities formed the wider religious atmosphere in which local claims could make sense. This is one of the important features of early dynastic religion. It was intensely local and broadly ordered at the same time. A city might speak most often of its own patron god, yet that god belonged to a larger divine world in which An, Enlil, Enki, Inanna, Nana, Utu, Ninhursag, Ningirsu, and many other powers held places within a shifting but meaningful hierarchy. Kish carried a different kind of prestige. In later tradition, kingship after the flood was said to have descended first to Kish, and the title King of Kish became a mark of wide authority even for rulers whose home lay elsewhere. This does not mean that Kish governed all of Sumer in one steady political structure, but it does show that early dynastic memory connected certain cities with claims reaching beyond local rule. Uruk remained a city of great antiquity and literary importance, associated with Inanna and with heroic traditions that would later gather around Gilgamesh. Held the cult of Nana and would grow in importance in later periods. Nippur, through Enlil, continued to offer a religious center whose prestige could exceed ordinary political boundaries. These cities did not need to become identical in function, because each carried a distinct sacred identity within the shared civilization of the southern plain. The rulers of early dynastic cities did not present themselves as secular commanders standing apart from religion. They built temples, restored shrines, dedicated objects, marked boundaries, sponsored offerings, and described their authority through divine favor. Their inscriptions often tell less about private personality than about the relationship between ruler and god, because the ruler's public self was shaped by the duties he performed for the divine house. This was true even when the ruler's actions were political or military in their consequences. A canal dug, a wall raised, a boundary confirmed, or a temple restored could all become signs that the ruler had fulfilled his place in the order of the city. The gods gave legitimacy, but legitimacy also had to be enacted through maintenance, construction, justice, and proper care of sacred property. Urukagina of Lagash, ruling later in the early dynastic age, became associated with reforms that addressed abuses in temple and civic life. The surviving inscriptions connected his measures with the will of Ningirsu and with the restoration of proper order for widows, orphans, temple households, and ordinary people burdened by officials. Modern scholars handle these texts carefully, but the broader significance is clear. justice could be described not as invention, but as a return to the rightful arrangement intended by the gods. This language of reform reveals how deeply moral and economic order were joined. Temple property, fees, labor obligations, household rights, and the conduct of officials all belong to the same world of divine accountability. A king or ruler who corrected abuses was not merely improving administration, because he was presenting himself as one who restored the balance between human society and sacred order. The early dynastic city therefore stood between household and cosmos. Its fields had measurable boundaries, its workers received rations, its scribes counted goods, its rulers made claims, and its temples received offerings. Yet above these visible arrangements stood the gods, whose authority explained why order mattered and why disorder could not be described only as inconvenience. In such a setting, the Anunnaki remained a category whose full literary richness would appear more clearly in later texts, but whose religious logic was already being prepared. The cities knew that authority could gather in assemblies. They knew that senior powers could confirm decisions. They knew that land, kingship, labor, and justice were not free-floating human arrangements, but parts of a divine order that reached above the city and beneath it. The relation between human assemblies and divine assemblies was not accidental. Early city life required councils, elders, officials, witnesses, oath procedures, and scribal records. These forms of civic order helped make it natural to imagine the gods themselves as gathered powers whose decrees gave force to the visible world. The Anunnaki, as great gods or solemn judges in later tradition, belonged to this same habit of thought. Oaths were especially important in a world where law, boundary, and divine witness met. When cities made agreements or rulers confirmed territorial claims, the gods could be invoked as guarantors of truth and consequence. To break an oath was not only to deceive another city, but to disturb a sacred relation whose effects could be imagined across generations. The material record of this period carries the texture of that ordered seriousness. Limestone and gypsum were carved into votive figures. Shell, lapis lazuli, and other imported materials entered elite and sacred objects. Clay tablets recorded distributions and transactions. Stone monuments held royal claims in forms meant to last longer than the voices that first declared them. Trade made this possible. Southern Mesopotamia lacked many valued materials, including good building stone, large timber, and metals, so the cities depended on exchange routes extending toward the Gulf, Iran, Anatolia, the Levant, and beyond. The goods that entered the temples and palaces were therefore signs not only of wealth, but of the city's ability to draw distant materials into the service of local gods. This movement of materials strengthened the sense that the city was both local and connected to a larger world. A temple built from mud brick might contain objects made from stone brought from far away, wood from uplands, metal from distant sources, and shells that had passed through trade networks. Each offering condensed geography into devotion, and the god's house became a place where the wider world was gathered and ordered. The rivalry of cities did not prevent cultural continuity. Scribes across the region shared signs, formulas, administrative habits, and literary traditions. Rulers might oppose one another, but the language of kingship, temple building, divine favor, and restored justice remained recognizable from one city to another. The gods differed in local importance, yet the structure of divine human relations remained broadly shared. This shared structure allowed later Mesopotamian theology to build larger arrangements out of older local foundations. When a god from one city gained wider prestige, that god did not enter an empty field, but a crowded divine society already rich with names and claims. The Anunnaki could become a collective term of weight because Mesopotamia had long practiced the art of placing many gods into ordered relation without erasing their local histories. By the end of the early dynastic period, the political world of Sumer had grown dense with precedent. Cities had competed and negotiated, rulers had marked their reigns through building and inscription, temple economies had expanded, and divine patronage had become inseparable from claims about territory and justice. The gods of the cities had become the guardians of memory, law, and order, while the broader divine assembly remained the imagined height before which human arrangements could be measured. This was the world that stood before the rise of Akkad. It was not a peaceful world, but its conflicts were narrated through order rather than chaos. Its inscriptions did not treat power as bare force, because power had to be placed under divine names, fixed to boundaries, witnessed by gods, and remembered in stone and clay. The Anunnaki's later story would unfold across empires, myths, and school traditions. But the early dynastic age gave them one of their deepest settings. Here, among rival cities, temple estates, boundary stones, carved monuments, and careful claims of justice, Mesopotamia learned to imagine authority as something gathered above human life and reflected within it. The gods owned land, received offerings, judged oaths, favored rulers, and held the pattern of the world in a form that cities could serve, contest, restore, and remember. Chapter 6. The Shaping of the Clay. The vessel on the shelf had not yet dried completely. Along its upper rim, where the clay was thinnest, the surface held a quality of slight darkness. Not wet, exactly, but not the pale dust color of fully dried clay either, something between the two states, the rim still giving slightly if pressed, the body below it firmer, the base firmest of all where the clay was thickest and the drying moved slowest. Near the base, almost invisible unless the light caught it at the correct angle, the faint impression of a thumb, the maker's thumb, pressing inward to check the wall's thickness at some point in the shaping, leaving its oval mark in the surface without intending to, without noticing the way the body leaves its record on the things it handles without asking permission. The room was warm from the afternoon outside and from the bodies that had been working in it since mid-morning. The smell of worked clay was everywhere, not the smell of the canal bank's wet silt, but something drier and more intimate, the smell of clay that had been in contact with hands long enough to warm from them, to lose the coldness of the storage jar and acquire the temperature of use. Along the shelves, other vessels in various stages of completion waited in the order of their making, the oldest ones pale and set, the newest ones still slightly dark at their edges, the whole row a record of the morning's work arranged by time. The consequence had arrived before anyone fully understood its cause. The great gods of the Anunnaki, the sky gods in their stations, the earth gods in their domains, the figures whose offices made the cosmos function, had assigned the labor of the world's maintenance to the Igigi, the lesser divine beings whose task was the physical work of the creation's upkeep. The canals needed digging, the riverbeds needed clearing, the irrigation channels needed maintenance. The world, in the understanding of the early theology, was not a self-maintaining system but a managed one, and the management required labor, and the labor had been assigned. The Igigi had been working for a very long time. The tablets do not give a number, because the time before humanity was not measured in the human units that make numbers meaningful. It was measured in the accumulation of toil, and the accumulation had reached a point that the Igigi could not continue past. They gathered before Enlil's gate at Nippur, and they set down their tools and they refused to resume. The tablets describe this moment with a compressed drama that is entirely characteristic of the tradition. The Igigi arrived at night. They set fire to their tools, They surrounded the house of Enlil, and Enlil, awakened, alarmed, the chief administrator of the divine order, confronted with a labor stoppage at the highest level of the cosmic maintenance system, asked his doorkeeper what was happening, and his doorkeeper told him. The assembly was convened. Anu descended from the sky, a rare enough event that the tablets mark it as significant, and the great gods sat together in the night and debated what to do with a cosmos whose maintenance workforce had collapsed. The question was not whether the maintenance needed to continue, it needed to continue. The question was who would do it if the Ajiji would not. Enki had the answer. He had, characteristically, considered the problem before the problem had been formally presented to him, and his answer was complete enough to suggest he had been holding it in reserve for some time, waiting for the assembly to reach the point where it would be ready to receive it. The answer was a new kind of being, not divine, not the formless matter of the world's substrate, but something between those categories, a being capable of labor and capable of intention, and capable of maintaining the relationship with the divine world that the temple system required, a being made from the materials of the earth, but animated by something that came from above the earth. Nine-Hersog, whose titles included Mother of the Gods and Lady of the Sacred Mound, whose domain was the stony ground at the edge of the alluvial plain where the rivers descended from the hills and the earth changed its character from soft silt to harder mineral, was the one whose hands shaped the clay. Enki provided the design, the animating principle, the divine blood that would be mixed into the clay to give the result its spark of divine connection. Nine-Hersog provided the shaping, the breath, the labor of the actual making. Between them, between the wisdom that knew what was needed and the generative force that could produce it, the first human being was made. The blood was taken from a god who was killed for the purpose. The Atrasis epic names this god as Geshtu-A, a minor divine figure whose name seems to contain the word for ear or intelligence, and describes the killing not as punishment but as sacrifice, the god's blood becoming the divine element in the human compound, the part of the human that connected downward to the earth through the clay and upward to the divine through the inherited blood. Later versions of the story, in the Akkadian tradition, would name this figure differently and emphasize different aspects of the transfer, but the essential structure remained. Humanity was made from two things combined, and one of those things came from the divine world and was not human in its origin. The purpose was stated plainly in the tablets, without apology and without sentimentality. Humans were made to bear the labor that the Ajiji had refused, to dig the canals, to clear the irrigation channels, to plant and harvest the fields, to manage the temple herds, to bring the offerings that fed the gods, to maintain the physical structures of the divine presence on earth. The theology did not describe this as exploitation. It described it as the proper order of things, the arrangement that allowed the cosmos to function, the gods governing, the humans maintaining, the maintenance of the physical world freeing the gods for the governance of it. And yet the tablets also describe Enki's attention to the shaping of the first human with something that exceeds the attention of a divine administrator solving a labor problem. He was interested in what he was making. The Atrasis epic and the related creation texts describe a series of experimental attempts, Nine-Hersog shaping figures that came out imperfect, incomplete, unable to perform the intended function. And Enki's response to each imperfect result was not frustration but curiosity, a craftsman's engagement with the problem of the form, the question of what adjustment would produce the result that was needed. The humans who came out of these experiments, the one who could not close his hands, the one who could not hold his urine, the one who was born into a body that could not stand upright, were given their places in the society rather than discarded, assigned roles that their specific limitations made possible rather than excluded for failing the standard that had not yet been established. This quality of attention, the god of craft and wisdom applying craft and wisdom to the making of the creature he intended to be the world's maintainer, gives the creation story a texture that the purely functional account would not have. Enki cared about the quality of what he made, not only about whether it would serve the required purpose, and the distinction between those two orientations is not trivial. A god who made humans only as labor substitutes would have stopped experimenting when the first functional version was achieved. A god who made humans as a craftsman makes a vessel, with attention to the form, with interest in the imperfect results, with a willingness to keep working until the thing was as good as it could be, produced something whose creation reflected the maker's character as well as the maker's need. Ninhursag's role in the creation was not secondary. The tablets that describe the making are clear that Enki's design required Ninhursag's execution to become real, that the animating principle in the divine blood required the shaping of the clay and the breath of the mother goddess to become a living thing rather than a mixture of materials. The Mesopotamian theology was consistently interested in this kind of paired creation. The wisdom that knows what is needed requiring the generative force that can produce it, neither sufficient without the other, the result belonging to both in ways that could not be separated after the fact. Ninhursag was an old goddess, older in some of the traditions than the organized pantheon of the Anunnaki in their stations, a goddess of the fundamental generative principle of the earth, the stony ground at the mountain's foot where the rivers began, the border between the alluvial plain and the harder world above it. Her association with childbirth and with the nursing of infants and with the suckling of kings, the images of a seated goddess nursing a figure on her lap, found across millennia of Mesopotamian religious art, gave her a quality of physical, embodied generativity that complemented Enki's more cerebral form of creation. Between them, the first human had both. The breath that animated the clay and blood mixture was in the tradition, literally the breath of the goddess, the divine exhalation that carried the animating principle into the form that had been shaped to receive it. The human being who resulted was alive because a goddess had breathed into it, and this fact was theological in its implications. The breath that kept the human alive from that moment forward was a continuation of the divine breath, a constant reminder of the connection between the human form and the divine world that had made it. To breathe was to participate, however distantly, in the life of the gods. The sound of clay being worked in the room had been a steady sound all morning, the soft impact of a fresh mass against the board, the wet drawing sound of hands pulling it across a surface, the occasional sharp sound of the clay being cut with a blade, the quieter sound of a vessel being coaxed upward from a rotating base. These sounds were so familiar as to have become part of the room's silence, the way the sound of water in a canal becomes part of the silence of the fields around it. The workers moved through the work without announcing it, without the extra sounds that accompanied unfamiliar effort. The clay responded as clay responds to hands that know it, with a cooperation that is not sentience but functions like it, the material and the craft arriving at the form together. Near the back of the room, the oldest worker, a man who had been shaping clay in this space for more years than most of the others had been alive, was working on nothing in particular, or nothing that had a name yet. His hands moved through the clay with the absorbed quality of a person thinking with their body rather than their mind, the form developing not from a predetermined design but from the clay's own suggestions as it moved between his palms. This was not the clay of the functional vessels on the shelf. This was a different kind of shaping, exploratory, patient, the hands asking a question and waiting for the answer to come up through the material. Whatever it was going to be, it was not finished. He set it down on the board before him, regarded it for a moment without expression, and covered it with a damp cloth to keep it workable. Then he took a new mass of clay and began again, the hands finding their angle, the material yielding to the familiar pressure, the afternoon continuing at the pace the afternoon had always kept. The theological question embedded in the creation story, the question of what it means to be made for a purpose, and whether the purpose exhausts the meaning of the made thing, was not a question that the Sumerian theological tradition answered directly. It did not answer it because it did not pose it in those terms. The tradition simply described the creation and the purpose together, without asking whether the purpose was the whole of the matter, and left the question in the space between what was said and what was left unsaid. But the question was there, in the attention Enki paid to the shaping of the imperfect versions, in the care Ninhursag brought to the breath that animated the clay, in the fact that the human beings who emerged from the failed experiments were given places in the society rather than dissolved back into the earth. The tradition did not say that humans were more than labor substitutes, but it did not behave as if they were only that. And the difference between the statement and the behavior is where most of the interesting theology lived. The Ijigi, meanwhile, had been relieved of their burden. The tablets describe their response to the creation of humanity with a satisfaction that is entirely divine in its brevity. They had been heard, their complaint had been addressed. The cosmic administration had found a solution. The world could continue. They returned to their stations in the sky, no longer required to dig the canals or maintain the channels. The physical work of the world's upkeep now delegated to the new creature sleeping in the shadow of the first temple. The clay vessel on the shelf had dried another small degree through the afternoon. The slight darkness along its upper rim had faded, the surface there now the same pale color as the body below it, the whole vessel a uniform dry cream. The thumb impression near the base just barely visible, a shallow oval, the mark of the hand that made the thing, left without intention and preserved without effort in the setting of the clay. The room was quieter now. The afternoon had moved past the hour of the main work. Two of the workers had gone. The oldest worker had covered his unfinished form with its damp cloth and was sitting near the door in the last of the direct afternoon light, his hands still, his eyes on the middle distance outside, the yard beyond the door where another vessel was drying in the open air, its shadow lengthening slowly eastward as the sun continued its descent. The sound of the room was the sound of drying clay, which was no sound at all. The vessels on the shelf held their forms in the stillness. The afternoon settled into the room the way afternoons settled into rooms at this hour, not arriving but simply being, having always been this temperature, this quiet, this quality of light going slowly toward the softer register of the hour before dusk. Chapter 7. The City at the Edge of the Deep. The mud brick of the outer wall still held the day's warmth long after the sun had gone from it. Standing against it in the early evening, the shoulder or the palm resting on the surface, the heat came through the cloth or through the skin, not as the aggressive heat of the noon hour, but as something slower and more residual, the wall releasing what it had accumulated through the day the way a body releases warmth after exertion, gradually, without urgency, the brick cooling from the outside inward so that the surface temperature lagged several hours behind the air temperature, and the wall remained warmer than the evening around it well into the night. The street on the other side of the wall was already cool. The air coming around the corner carried the first suggestion of the night's chill, but the wall itself, the wall that had been facing the southern sky since before midday, was still warm, and the warmth was specific and even, and had a quality of patience to it, as if the brick had decided to hold what it had received for as long as possible before surrendering it to the dark. The city at this hour was not quiet exactly, but it was moving toward quiet. The market sounds had ended. The last of the day's transactions had been completed. The clay tablets sealed and set aside. The goods moved from the public spaces into the storage rooms that lined the interior of the temple precinct. The streets in the residential quarters carried the sounds of the evening meal being prepared, the thud of a wooden implement against a flat stone, the smell of something rendered down in fat moving through the narrow passage between buildings, a child's voice somewhere above, the specific quality of sound that a city produces when its daytime business is finished, and its nighttime domestic life has not yet fully settled. Nippur sat in the center of the Mesopotamian plain with the authority of a city that did not need to be the largest or the wealthiest to be the most important. Other cities had more people, more commerce, more military power at various points in the long span of the civilization's history. Nippur had the Ikur and the Ikur, the house of the mountain, Enlil's temple, the place where the divine assembly convened in its earthly form and where the legitimacy of every king from Ur to Babylon was ultimately certified, gave Nippur a theological centrality that political power could not replicate and military force could not transfer. The name Ikur was a statement of paradox for anyone who looked at the landscape around it. There were no mountains on the Mesopotamian plain. The plain was flat in every direction from Nippur, flat to the rivers and flat beyond the rivers, and flat to the horizon in all four directions. And the highest point on it was whatever ziggurat happened to be tallest in whichever city was currently most ambitious about its building program. To call Enlil's temple the House of the Mountain was to name it for something absent from its surroundings, to invoke the mountains from which the rivers descended, the high country that was Enlil's original domain before the plain required his attention, the elevation that was available in the theology even when it was not available in the geography. The mountain was a theological mountain. Its height was the height of divine authority rather than the height of stone. And the ziggurat that rose above the Ikur complex was its earthly argument, the built claim that here, on this flat ground, there was something that rose above the plain, something that reached toward the sky's authority, something that the surrounding flatness could not diminish because its significance was not architectural but cosmic. Enlil's character across the tablets is harder to settle into than Enki's, and the difficulty is theological rather than literary. Enki was individuated, his personality was specific, his methods were recognizable, his relationship with humanity was warm enough that his advocacy for the flood survivor did not feel out of character. Enlil was something less personal and more elemental. He was the wind. He was the breath that separated heaven from earth in the primordial moment, the force that moved through the space between the sky above and the ground below, and that could not be stopped from doing so by any obstruction. The wind on the Mesopotamian plain was not a minor phenomenon. It came from the northwest in the summer months and from the southeast in the winter, and it came with a persistence and a force that the flat landscape did nothing to moderate, no hills or forests to break its momentum, just the open plain receiving it from one horizon to the other. In the summer, the wind carried dust, fine enough to penetrate cloth and plaster both, covering everything with a pale film, reducing the visibility across the plain to a gray-brown haze that turned the distant ziggurats into suggestions rather than structures. In the winter, the wind carried cold, the highland cold from the mountain ranges to the north and east, descending onto the plain with nothing to warm it in transit. This wind was Enlil's personality made physical, the quality of inevitability, of the force that moved through everything without asking permission and without considering the convenience of what it moved through. This was the theological character of the god, rendered in daily experience every time the wind crossed the plain, and there was nothing to do about it except adjust. You could honor Enlil, you could perform the correct rituals and maintain the Ikur in proper condition and ensure the offerings were timely and the priests were properly trained. What you could not do was ask him to moderate his essential nature, because his essential nature was the wind, and the wind was what it was. The story of Enlil and Ninlil is one of the stranger narratives in the Sumerian literary tradition. Strange in the way that myths are strange when they are doing theological work that exceeds their apparent subject. On its surface, it is the story of Enlil's encounter with the young goddess Ninlil at the river. Ninlil had been warned by her mother not to bathe in the pure canal, not to walk along the bank of the canal, because Enlil's eyes were upon her and Enlil's intentions were not straightforwardly honorable. Ninlil bathed in the canal. Enlil found her there and approached her. and the union that followed had consequences that required the story to continue past the point where a simpler narrative would have ended. The consequence was Nanna's conception, the moon god forming in the result of that encounter, a divine being of the highest importance whose birth required the story to work through its complications before it could arrive at its proper outcome. Enlil was banished by the divine assembly for his conduct, sent from Nippur into the underworld, the land of no return, the place where Ereshkigal held her domain, and the banishment posed a theological problem, because a god of Enlil's cosmic importance could not simply remain in the underworld and leave the air between heaven and earth unmanaged. The story worked through this problem by a series of disguises and encounters that eventually brought Enlil back from the underworld's edge, the moon god safely born, the cosmic order restored, the narrative having performed the work of demonstrating that even the most severe of the great gods was subject to the assembly's judgment and could be held accountable for conduct that exceeded what the divine order permitted. Ninlil, in the story's resolution, followed Enlil into his exile and remained with him, and the tablets describe their reconciliation with a compression that leaves the emotional texture to the listener's inference. What the story preserved across its centuries of tablet transmission was the theological argument that the divine assembly's authority extended even to the conduct of the great gods, that Enlil's power over the wind did not exempt him from the system of divine governance, that the cosmos was rule-governed in ways that applied at every level of the hierarchy. Nanna was born from this story and was the moon, and the moon over the Mesopotamian plain was a different presence than the moon over a mountainous landscape or a forested one. The plain had nothing to interrupt the sky, no ridgeline to hold the moon as it rose, no canopy to filter its light as it climbed. The moon came up over the eastern horizon with nothing between it and the observer except the flat distance of the plain, and it rose quickly, the way things rise quickly when the horizon is low, visibly moving, perceptibly climbing, the rate of its ascent apparent in a way that it was not when the horizon was cluttered with the profiles of hills. The silver boat was the image the tablets used for Nanna's monthly journey, and standing on the plain and watching the moon cross the enormous sky, the image made its own argument. The moon did move the way a boat moves, carried by something, going in a direction, crossing a surface rather than floating in a void. The sky above the plain was surface enough, the moon's reflection in the canal below, arriving as a second moon in the dark water, traveling with the first but below it, going in the same direction at the same pace, made the boat image almost literal, the sky and the water together, providing the two elements of a river, the moon between them as the thing that crossed. Nanna's city was to the south and east of Nippur, near the edge of the marshes, and the great ziggurat of Nammu dedicated to the moon god was the most complete of all Mesopotamian ziggurats, the one that gave the later scholars the clearest sense of what these structures had looked like when they were new and fully functioning. 3 terraces rising from a broad base, each terrace smaller than the one below it, the whole structure oriented to the cardinal directions, the stairway on the northeast face leading from the plain level to the highest terrace where the shrine room waited. The ziggurat was not a place of public worship. The public did not climb the stairway. The ziggurat was the god's house on earth, the place where the divine presence was closest to the surface, and its height was the architectural statement that the divine presence was above the human one and required the human one to look upward to acknowledge it. The temple economy of under Nanna's patronage was one of the most thoroughly documented institutions in the ancient world, its records preserved in tens of thousands of clay tablets covering centuries of administrative detail. The temple owned land, the temple owned herds, the temple owned boats that carried goods along the rivers and the coastal routes. The temple employed workers and paid them in rations, barley, oil, wool, beer, and the management of the ration system generated the records that preserved it. The scribes producing tablet after tablet of account and receipt and labor register, each one a small document of the daily life of the institution, each one fired or dried and filed and forgotten until the excavators found them. Beer appeared in these records constantly because beer was a fundamental substance in the temple economy and in the broader economy of the plain. Barley beer, brewed from the same grain that was the civilization's staple food, drunk daily by workers and administrators and priests, offered on the divine tables in the inner sanctum, was not a luxury, it was a ration good, part of the daily compensation for labor, as standard a payment as the barley it was made from. The divine tables received the same beer the workers drank, because the offering was not a special substance set aside for the gods, but the best of the ordinary substance that sustained the civilization. Nana drank barley beer. The workers who maintained his ziggurat drank barley beer. The scribes who recorded the barley allocations drank barley beer. The shared substance was part of what made the theology coherent. The same world that fed the humans fed the gods, and the feeding of the gods was the humans' contribution to the maintenance of the world that fed them both. The tablet records of preserve the names of individuals, workers and administrators and craftspeople, with a specificity that makes the institution feel inhabited rather than institutional. A woman named Shulgi Simti oversaw a kitchen that provided meals to the temple's ritual personnel. A man whose name the tablet gives as Nama managed the wool allocation for a weaving workshop attached to the temple precinct. An administrator named Akala appears in hundreds of documents spanning decades, his name always in the same position in the tablet's formula. His role apparently stable across a professional lifetime of managing the flow of goods through a complex institution. These names are not famous names. They are not the names of kings or gods or heroes. They are the names of the people who kept the institution running, whose daily work produced the surplus that funded the theology, and whose daily records preserved the detail that allowed later scholars to reconstruct what the institution had been. They had no expectation of being remembered. The tablets they produced were administrative documents, not monuments. The scribes who pressed their styluses into the wet clay in the offices of the Ekur and the storehouses of Ur's harbor district were doing their jobs, managing the accounts, keeping the records current. That those records would survive 4,000 years in the soil of southern Iraq, to be excavated by British archaeologists and translated by scholars who had spent careers learning a language no one had spoken for 2 millennia, was not a consideration that entered into the calculation of any individual scribe on any individual morning. They pressed the stylus into the clay because the clay was there, and the stylus was there, and the account needed maintaining. The rest was the accident of preservation. The full moon was rising above the plain to the east, coming up over the flat horizon with the visible speed of a moon that has nothing to interrupt its ascent. Its reflection had found the canal, the long irrigation channel that ran north from the city toward the fields, and was traveling in the water below the sky, the 2 moons moving together, the one above cold and white and the one below dark and slightly rippled where the water moved, both of them going in the same direction, west, as the plain rotated below them at its steady pace. The mud brick wall along the canal path still held its warmth from the afternoon. The air had cooled around it, but the wall itself remained, a degree or 2 above the air temperature, the stored heat releasing slowly into the night. A palm frond somewhere above the wall moved in the small evening wind, its shadow falling across the path and then lifting, falling and lifting, the frond responding to each eddy of air with the patient flexibility of something that had been doing this for years. The moon climbed, its reflection in the canal steadied as the surface wind dropped and the water settled. The 2 moons aligned, one above, one below, the canal between them perfectly still, holding the silver light without commentary, without offering it back as anything other than what it was. Chapter 8. Inanna's Descent. Inanna was the morning star and the evening star, and the fact that these were the same star, the planet that the later Greeks would call Aphrodite, the bright wanderer that appeared before sunrise in the eastern sky and reappeared before sunset in the western sky, vanishing between these appearances into the sun's brightness for a period of weeks, gave her mythology its deepest structural logic. She appeared and disappeared and appeared again. She was present and then absent and then present again, and the cycle of her presence and absence was not arbitrary but regular, governed by the same celestial mechanics that governed everything in the sky above the plain, and the theology that had grown up around her took this regularity as its organizing principle. The descent was not a catastrophe. It was the other half of the cycle. She was also the goddess of love and war, which the Mesopotamian tradition did not experience as contradictory. Both were domains of overwhelming force that arrived without warning and reorganized everything they touched. And the goddess who governed both was therefore the goddess of the kind of power that exceeded the ordinary management of the world, the power that overrode the careful maintenance of the hierarchy and the proper performance of the ritual, and simply moved through the world as it needed to move. Her hymns are the most emotionally immediate texts in the Sumerian literary tradition, full of a first-person intensity that the hymns to Anu or Enlil do not approach. Inanna speaking in her own voice about her own beauty and her own desire and her own anger, with a directness that the more administrative theologies of the sky gods and the air gods could not accommodate. She was, at the moment the descent story begins, a great goddess in her own right. She held Uruk. She had obtained the Mi from Enki and established them in her city, and her city had flourished because of it. She had a husband, Dumuzid, the shepherd king, whose relationship with her was the subject of a body of love poetry that is among the oldest love poetry in the world, delicate and specific in its imagery, the two of them speaking to each other across the tablets in terms that are entirely human in their texture despite the divine status of the speakers. She had, in other words, everything that the upper world could offer. What she decided to enter the lower world to obtain or accomplish, the tablets explain variously and not entirely convincingly, which is itself a theological truth about the nature of the kind of force that Inanna represented, the force that does not explain itself before acting and cannot fully account for its own motivations after. She dressed for the descent with a deliberateness that the tablets describe in careful detail, because the detail mattered. Each item she put on or took up was a specific form of divine power, and the list of her preparations was the list of her attributes, the full inventory of what Inanna was and had and could do. The crown on her head, the shugura, the crown of the plane, was her authority over the earth's surface. The lapis lazuli beads at her throat were her beauty and her dignity. The breastplate at her chest was called "Come Man, Come" in the tablet's description, which names its function without ambiguity. The gold ring at her wrist was her power of judgment. The lapis lazuli measuring rod and line she carried in her hand were the instruments of divine assessment, the tools by which the world was measured and found to be what it was. She gathered all of this around her, and she went to the gate of the underworld, and she knocked. The underworld in the Mesopotamian theology was not a place of punishment. It was simply the other country, the Kur, the land of no return, the place beneath the earth where the dead went and remained, living a diminished version of the life they had known above, eating dust and clay, wearing the garment of feathers that the tablets described as the afterlife's clothing. Ereshkigal ruled there, Inanna's older sister, the great lady of the great below, a goddess as powerful in her domain as Inanna was in hers, but a goddess whose power had no outlet into the upper world, and whose existence was therefore defined by its containment, its depth, its distance from the light. The relationship between the two sisters is the emotional center of the descent story, and it is a relationship that the tablets render with considerable ambiguity. Ereshkigal was not a villain, she was the queen of her own domain, and Inanna's arrival was an intrusion, a great goddess of the upper world, dressed in all her attributes and all her authority, arriving uninvited at the gate of the underworld with intentions that Ereshkigal could not trust. The instructions Ereshkigal gave to her gatekeeper Neti were the instructions of a sovereign protecting her domain. Let the visitor enter, but apply the law of the underworld, the law that applied to every soul that entered and that had no exceptions. At each gate, one attribute would be surrendered. By the time she reached the throne room, she would be nothing but herself, stripped of the forms of power that defined her identity in the upper world, standing before the Queen of the Dead as an equal, or less than an equal, on the Queen's own ground. Neti was the chief gatekeeper, and he performed his function with the formal precision that the ritual of the 7 gates required. At the first gate, he took the crown from Inanna's head, the Shigura, and when she protested, asking what this was, why this was happening, his answer was the answer that would be given at each of the 6 gates that followed. The ways of the underworld are perfect, Inanna. Do not question the ways of the underworld. At the 2nd gate, the lapis lazuli beads. At the 3rd gate, the breastplate. At the 4th gate, the gold ring. At the 5th gate, the lapis lazuli measuring rod and line. At the 6th gate, the breastplate of observation. At the 7th gate, the royal robe. What arrived in the throne room of Ereshkigal was Inanna without her attributes. Inanna as pure being, stripped of the specific forms of power that her identity in the upper world consisted of, present as the self beneath the self, the part of the goddess that existed before and below all the particular capabilities she had accumulated and displayed. This stripped presence was what Ereshkigal saw when she turned her gaze on her sister, and the gaze of the Queen of the Dead was described by the tablets as the gaze of death, and Inanna, struck by it, became a corpse. The tablets say she was hung on a hook on the wall of the underworld. This is the image that the descent story rests on, not the dramatic moment of the confrontation, not the exchange of words between the sisters, but the afterward, the stillness of the thing that was Inanna hanging on the wall in the silence, in the dark, 3 days and 3 nights passing over the upper world, while the morning and evening star were absent from the sky, and the world above registered the loss as an absence in the regular pattern of appearances and disappearances that governed the celestial order. Something moves in the dark below the surface of things, not quickly, slowly, the way water moves through clay, finding its path by pressure rather than force, taking the time that the material requires. The stairs go down from the threshold stone, from the place where the door meets the ground and the ground meets the beginning of the descent, and the air changes within the first few steps. Not a dramatic change, not the sudden cold of a plunge, but a gradual quality of stillness, the air that has not moved in a long time carrying its stillness as a texture, a weight against the skin of the face and the hands, different from the air above that is always slightly in motion, always carrying something from somewhere to somewhere else. The hand finds the wall. The stone is cool and slightly rough, the texture of it the primary information available about where the body is in the space. The darkness being complete enough that the eyes are not useful here, only the palm and the fingertips reading the surface as it passes. The sound from the world above, whatever sound the world above was producing at the moment of the descent, becomes a quality of absence rather than a sound, the way a sound that has been present for a long time becomes noticeable only when it stops. The stairs continue. The wall continues. The cool continues, deepening with each step, the temperature dropping in small increments that are perceptible only over the span of several steps rather than at each individual one. At the bottom of the stairs there is a quality of air that has not moved since a time before memory. It is not hostile. It is simply the air of a place that does not participate in the exchanges of the upper world. The warmth and cooling, the wind and the stillness, the movement of things from one state to another that constitutes the daily life of the surface. Here things remain, Here nothing is on its way to somewhere else. The hook on the wall is iron and cold, and the cold of it is the cold of a thing that has been this temperature for longer than cold is usually a temporary condition. It is cold the way stone is cold, not as a state it will warm out of, but as a property of its substance. This is the depth to which she descended. This is the place where she hung for 3 days and 3 nights while the sky above missed her light and the upper world waited, without knowing it was waiting, for the cycle to resume. Enki was the one who noticed the absence, or more precisely, Enki was the one who acted on the absence while the other great gods declined to act. When Inanna's servant Ninshubur, whom Inanna had instructed before the descent to seek help from the gods if she did not return, came to Enlil's temple at Nippur, and then to Nanna's temple at Ur, both gods refused. The reasons they offered were variations on the same theological point. Inanna had entered the underworld by choice, following its laws, and the underworld's laws were the underworld's laws, and the precedent of rescuing a great goddess from the consequences of her own decision to enter the land of no return was a precedent that would destabilize the cosmic order in ways neither of them was willing to authorize. Enki listened differently. He listened with the attention of a god for whom a problem was also an invitation to find the solution that the problem's structure permitted, and the structure of this problem, the laws of the underworld intact, the Queen of the Dead's authority unviolated, but Inanna's life recovered, was the kind of structural challenge that Enki's particular intelligence was designed to engage with. He took the dirt from under his fingernails. From this material, with no ceremony and no elaborate preparation, he fashioned 2 small beings, the Kurgara and the Galatur, sexless figures whose smallness made them capable of entering the underworld without triggering the full application of the 7-gate protocol that had stripped Inanna of her attributes. He sent them down with instructions. They were to find Ereshkigal, who would be in pain. The tablets specify that she was suffering, grieving, her body aching, her cries filling the throne room, and they were to reflect her pain back to her, to moan with her when she moaned, to grieve with her when she grieved, to offer nothing but sympathetic witnessing of her suffering, and in return for this witnessing they were to ask for the corpse on the hook. The instruction was Enki's most precise demonstration of his methodology. The solution was not to overpower Ereshkigal, but to give her something she needed, and what she needed was not negotiation or argument or divine authority, but simply to be heard in her pain. Ereshkigal gave them the corpse. The Kurgara and the Galatur sprinkled it with the food of life and the water of life that Enki had sent with them. And Inanna rose, and the stars returned to the sky above the plain in their proper sequence, the morning star appearing before sunrise and the evening star appearing before dark, the cycle resuming as cycles resume, not with announcement, but with the simple fact of the thing being present again after its absence. But the law of the underworld held. Something had to remain in exchange for what had left. The demons of the underworld accompanied Inanna back to the surface, and they required a substitute, someone to take the place of the goddess in the land of no return, to maintain the balance that the underworld's laws required. The tablets describe Inanna's return to the upper world with the demons at her side, moving through the cities of the plain, finding at each one a figure prostrate in mourning, dressed in sackcloth, weeping for her absence, and at each one she refused to hand the mourner to the demons, because the mourning was sincere and the sincerity was its own argument. At Uruk she found Dumuzid. He was seated on his throne in his finest clothes. He was not in mourning. He had been managing the kingdom in her absence with an equanimity that the tablets describe without editorial comment, but with a precision that allows the reader to form their own assessment of what that equanimity meant. Inanna looked at him. The tablets say she looked at him with the look of death, and she handed him to the demons, and Dumuzid ran. The hook on the wall in the underworld was empty now. The cold remained. the air that had not moved in a time before memory continued to not move. The darkness below the last stair was the same darkness it had always been, and the iron hook was the same temperature it had always been, and the silence of the cur was the silence of the place from which sound had been absent for so long that the absence had become the place's primary quality. Not the absence of something that had been there, but the presence of a stillness so old that it had become a substance. Above, the plain received the morning star in the east. The flat horizon gave it nothing to rise behind. It simply appeared incrementally brighter than the stars around it, then distinctly brighter, then alone in the sky above the eastern plain as the stars faded and the light of the coming sun preceded its rise. The morning star was present. The cycle had turned. The descent was complete and its return was complete, and what remained between them was the story, pressed into clay in tablet houses across the plain, recited in temple courtyards by priests who had learned it as part of the liturgical curriculum, carried across centuries in the keeping of people who understood that the story was not merely about a goddess, but about the nature of the world's fundamental rhythms, the descent and the return, the absence and the presence, the hook on the wall and the star in the sky, and the long necessary darkness between them. Chapter 9. The Division of the World. By the early centuries of the third millennium before the Common Era, in the long period that the archaeologists would later call the early dynastic, when the cities of the Mesopotamian plain had found their forms and their rivalries, and the institution of the temple state had reached the administrative complexity that made it both powerful and fragile, the theological picture had settled into something that felt, to the people living inside it, like a description of the world as it had always been and would always be. The divine hierarchy was in place. The three tiers of the cosmos were occupied by their appropriate powers. The Anunnaki were in their stations, and the Igigi were in theirs, and the humans were on the surface of the earth maintaining the canals and filling the offering tables and producing the surplus that the temple economies distributed back through the labor force that had produced it. The world was a managed world, and its management had a structure, and the structure had the quality of permanence that structures acquire when they have been in place long enough that no living person remembers their establishment. The texts that preserve the formal account of how this structure came to be were themselves products of this settled period, composed or compiled in the scribal schools of Nippur and Eridu and by scholars who were not recording fresh revelation, but organizing and transmitting a tradition already old, already layered, already carrying within it the traces of the earlier, simpler formulations from which the mature theology had grown. The Atrahasis epic, which contains the most complete surviving account of the division of the world among the three great brothers and the events that followed it, was composed in the Old Babylonian period, roughly the 18th century BCE, though the traditions it drew on were certainly older, certainly reaching back through the Akkadian period into the Sumerian originals whose cuneiform traces the later scribes were reading and synthesizing. The division itself was a casting of lots. This is worth holding for a moment, because the choice of mechanism carries theological weight that a different choice would not. The three brothers, Anu, Enlil, Enki, were equals in the moment of the division, or close enough to equals that a lottery was the appropriate instrument for distributing an inheritance among them. The sky was not Anu's because he had taken it by force, or because he was older, or because he was wiser. It was Anu's because the lot fell to him, and the lot falling to him was the outcome of a process that the three had agreed to before the lots were cast, and their agreement was the foundation of the arrangement's legitimacy. The Atrahasis epic states the division plainly, in the register of a legal document recording the terms of an agreement. They took the lot and cast it, and Anu went up to the sky, and Enlil took the earth, and the bolt, the bar of the sea, they gave to Enki the prince. The bolt and the bar of the sea, the locks of the Abzu, the mechanisms by which the underground water was held or released, went to Enki as his share of the inheritance, and the deep below the earth was his domain as the sky above it was Anu's, and the surface between them was Enlil's. The arrangement that resulted was, in the theological understanding of the tradition, the arrangement of the world itself, not the arrangement of a mythology, but the arrangement of the actual cosmos, the real distribution of authority over the real domains that constituted the real world. When it rained, that was Enlil's decision. When the well water was sweet, that was Enki's management. When the stars held their courses, that was Anu's order persisting. The division was not a story told about the world, it was the world's actual structure, given a narrative form that made it possible to transmit. The cool of the temple storehouse in mid-morning was a specific cool, not the cold of the night still held in the stone, because by mid-morning the stone had given up the night's cold and had not yet accumulated the day's heat, and what remained was the temperature of a large enclosed space that was insulated from the direct sun by its thick walls and its depth below the level of the courtyard outside. The ceiling was low, the walls close, the floor earth rather than brick, and along the walls the storage jars stood in their rows, the large jars of barley sealed with bitumen-daubed clay stoppers, the medium jars of oil, the smaller jars of beer waiting for the ritual allocation, each vessel in its position on the shelving that the workers had built from cedar planks brought at considerable expense from the north. The smell arrived before the eye could read the contents of the room. Barley in quantity had a smell that was both dry and alive. The grain itself dry, the germ of it carrying a faint vitality that expressed itself as a barely perceptible sweetness in the mineral dryness of the stored mass. And over this, the cedar of the shelving, warm and resinous even in the cool of the storehouse. The smell of the wood that had traveled from the mountain forests and now held up the provisions of the temple. And under both of these, present in the room's deep air, the smell of the bitumen that had sealed the older jars, dark and mineral and ancient. The smell of the earth's deep substance brought to the surface for the practical purpose of keeping the grain dry and the beer sealed. A single pale stripe of light fell through the gap in the upper wall where the ventilation slot had been left between the brickwork and the roofing timber. The stripe lay across the floor at a slight angle, crossing the earth in a path that moved slowly through the morning, the light's position in the room a clock of sorts. The stripe reaching the base of the eastern shelving at mid-morning and climbing it slowly through the afternoon. At this hour it lay on the floor, illuminating a section of the earth that looked no different from the earth outside the stripe, the light making visible only what was already there. The Ijigi had been restored to their stations after the creation of humanity, but the tablets that describe the post-creation divine order are careful to preserve the distinction between the Anunnaki and the Ijigi as two separate classes within the cosmic hierarchy. The Anunnaki were the great gods, the principal figures of the divine government, the ones who held the major offices and whose decisions shaped the world's fundamental conditions. The Iji were the lesser sky gods, the ones whose labor had been the occasion of humanity's creation, and their position in the hierarchy after the creation was subtly different from their position before it. They had demonstrated the limits of their willingness to maintain the cosmic infrastructure by force of divine obligation alone, and the theology had absorbed this demonstration by creating an alternative maintenance force that did not require divine coercion to function. The relationship between the Anunnaki and the Ijigi in the post-creation theology is not always clearly delineated in the surviving texts. The terms were used inconsistently across different periods and different traditions, sometimes overlapping, sometimes distinguishing carefully between them. What the Atrasis epic preserved was the structural logic. The great gods governed, the lesser gods assisted in the governance, and the humans performed the maintenance. And the three-tier arrangement of the divine world was therefore mirrored in a three-tier arrangement of the functional world, each level performing its assigned role in the system that the division of the cosmos had established. The divine assembly that convened at Nippur to manage the crises that the creation had been intended to resolve was the earthly expression of this hierarchy. The great gods sat in their order of precedence. The lesser Anunnaki stood at the periphery. The business of the cosmos was conducted in the form of deliberation. Speeches made, positions argued, consensus sought, decisions formalized and decreed. The assembly was not a rubber stamp for Enlil's preferences or Anu's authority. It was a working, deliberative body whose decisions reflected the actual balance of divine power, and whose records, preserved in the literary texts that described its sessions, showed a process that was capable of both consensus and conflict, of both swift decision and prolonged negotiation. The tangent that the beer requires is not a digression from the theology, it is embedded in it. Barley beer, Ninkasi's gift, as the hymn to the goddess of brewing described it, the hymn that was also a recipe, the theological and practical woven into the same text, was present in the divine world before it was present in the human one, because everything that existed in the human world had its divine original, its me, its prior existence in Enki's Absu before it was distributed to the surface. The beer that Enki and Inanna drank at the banquet in the Absu was the divine original of which the beer in the storehouse jars was the human copy, and the human copy was not inferior to the original by virtue of being a copy. It was the original's fulfillment, the me of brewing realized in the hands of the brewer and the grain of the field and the water of the canal and the warmth of the kiln. The hymn to Ninkasi is the oldest surviving beer recipe in the world. It is also a hymn, a formal religious text praising the goddess of brewing through the description of her craft, the two functions indistinguishable in the composition because they were indistinguishable in the tradition. To describe the process of brewing correctly was to honor the goddess who governed it. To honor the goddess correctly required describing the process of brewing accurately. The ritual and the practical were not separate registers in the Mesopotamian understanding of the sacred. They were the same register, the correct performance of the human activity being itself the religious act. The world maintained through the proper execution of the tasks that the me had established as the foundations of civilization. Beer appeared on the divine tables of every major temple on the plain. It appeared in the ration lists of the workers who maintained those temples. It appeared in the contracts that recorded the terms of labor agreements, specified as part of the daily compensation due to a worker for a defined task. It appeared in the lists of gifts appropriate for a great occasion. It appeared in the marriage negotiations preserved in the legal tablets, as part of what passed between families when a formal alliance was being established. It was everywhere because it was fundamental, not as an intoxicant, though it was that too, but as the liquid form of the civilization's primary crop, the transformation of barley into a substance that could be stored longer than grain, transported more easily than grain, shared in the formal contexts that required a shared substance, and offered to the gods as the best product of the labor that the gods had created humanity to perform. The sealed jar at the base of the storehouse wall had been there since the previous month's allocation. Its stopper was sealed with bitumen, the seal intact, the jar's contents waiting for the ritual occasion that would require them to be opened. It was not a remarkable jar. It was one of several dozen in the same section of the storehouse, all sealed, all waiting, all part of the inventory that the temple administrator would check against his records when the allocation day came, and the sealed jars would become open jars, and the open jars would become empty jars, and the empty jars would be returned to the workshop, where they would be cleaned and refilled and resealed and returned to the shelf. The light in the storehouse had moved another small distance across the floor during the time that the room had been inhabited only by its contents and the cool that the walls preserved. The pale stripe had climbed the lower edge of the eastern shelving and was moving up the face of the lowest row of jars, illuminating the curve of the clay, the texture of the bitumen seal at the stopper, the slight imperfection in the jar's surface where a bubble in the clay had been smoothed over during the shaping but not entirely eliminated. The smell of the cedar and the barley and the bitumen continued. The cool continued. The jars on the shelves continued to hold what they held, sealed and patient. The contents unchanged. The ritual occasion that would open them still somewhere in the future. The allocation day still coming. The ceremony that would pour the contents onto the divine table still waiting for its appointed time in the temple calendar's steady round. The divine assembly at Nippur had made its decisions across the centuries, had decreed the flood and then regretted the flood, had assigned the creation of humanity and absorbed the consequences of that assignment, had managed the ongoing administration of a cosmos whose complexity increased with every addition to the civilization below. It was not a static body. It changed as the theological tradition changed, as new cities rose to prominence and their patron gods required accommodation in the hierarchy, as conquests and alliances among the cities on the plain required corresponding adjustments in the divine order that legitimized those political realities. This flexibility, the capacity of the assembly to absorb change without losing its essential structure, was the feature of the Mesopotamian theological system that allowed it to survive the transitions from Sumerian to Akkadian to Babylonian to Assyrian political dominance, each transition accompanied by adjustments in the divine hierarchy that preserved the core architecture while shifting the positions of specific figures within it. The three-tier cosmos remained. The division among Anu, Enlil, and Enki remained, recast in Akkadian names and Babylonian narrative frames but recognizable in its structure. The divine assembly remained. The me remained, distributed through the same logic, administered through the same theology. What changed was the center of gravity. Which city's patron god held the highest active position in the hierarchy? Which narrative organizing the tradition's cosmological account received the most ceremonial attention? Which king's legitimizing mythology drew most directly on the assembly's formal authority? The structure was the constant. The center of gravity moved across the plane as the political history moved, and the theology accommodated each movement with the patience of a system that had been designed, whether consciously or not, to be accommodating. The sealed jar rested against the cool base of the storehouse wall. Above it on the shelves, the rows of jars held their contents in the mid-morning quiet. The light stripe had climbed further up the eastern shelving, and the room was as it had been, cool, dim, smelling of cedar and barley and the dark mineral note of bitumen. The provisions of the temple waiting in their order for the uses that the temple calendar had already determined, and the temple administrator had already recorded in the tablets filed in the office adjacent to the courtyard. The world outside the storehouse was fully in its mid-morning business. The world inside was in its mid-morning stillness. Between them, the thick mud brick wall maintained the distinction. The one side warm and loud and transactional, and the other side cool and quiet, and in possession of the patience that belongs to things that are already in their correct places, waiting for nothing except the appointed time. Chapter 10. The Flood That Filled the Plain. The mountains emerged from the receding water at dawn. Their shapes were dark against the pale sky. Not the sharp profiles they would have shown before the flood, but something softer, their lower slopes still submerged, the waterline cutting across them at an angle that made them look like islands rather than mountains, like things that had always risen from water rather than things that water had temporarily covered. The sky above them was the particular pale gray of the hour before the sun clears the horizon, and the surface of the water below was the same pale gray, and the mountains between the two gray surfaces were the only dark thing in the world, motionless, as if they had been standing there in exactly this position for the entire duration of the flood, waiting without impatience for the water to drop far enough to make them visible again. The boat had grounded on the previous day. The grounding had been gradual, a resistance encountered in the water's motion, a slowing, a settling, the hull finding the angle of the submerged slope and resting against it, and the man on the boat had not immediately understood what the resistance meant, had not known whether the water had reached its limit or whether this was a temporary pause before another rising. He had waited through the night with that uncertainty, and the morning had answered it. The mountains were visible. The water was lower than it had been at dusk, and the world was beginning the slow process of returning to itself. The condition that produced the flood had been developing for a long time before it became a crisis. Humanity, created to bear the labor that the Igigi had refused, distributed across the surface of the plain, and set to the work of maintaining the canals and filling the temple offerings and managing the fields, had multiplied. This was expected. This was the design. The creation of humanity had been, among other things, a solution to a labor shortage. And a successful solution to a labor shortage required the labor force to grow as the managed world grew. Humanity had grown. The fields had expanded. The cities had grown denser. The sounds of human activity, the hammering and the grinding and the buying and the selling and the arguing and the singing and all the other sounds that a civilization at full operation produced, had accumulated on the plain and risen into the air above it, and Enlil could not sleep. The tablets state this with a plainness that is itself a kind of theological statement. The chief administrator of the divine order, the god of the air and the wind and the space between heaven and earth, lying awake in his palace at Nippur, while the noise of humanity rose from the plain below and prevented the rest that the god of the air apparently required. The complaint was not metaphorical. Enlil was disturbed. The disturbance was real, and the solution he proposed to the divine assembly was the solution of a god who had reached the limit of his patience with a situation he had the power to end. The assembly had not immediately agreed to the flood. The theology's preservation of this detail, that the decision required deliberation, that it was not simply Enlil's unilateral decree, but a decision that the assembled great gods arrived at through a process that included, presumably, the arguments for and against, was consistent with the tradition's understanding of how the divine government operated. Even the most severe decision in the history of the cosmos required the assembly's sanction. Even the flood was a policy rather than an impulse. Enki had not agreed, or had not agreed fully, or had agreed in the formal sense while reserving the possibility of a technical exception. The tablets are not entirely consistent on this point, and the inconsistency may be preserved deliberately. The tradition was comfortable with the ambiguity of a god who could simultaneously be bound by an assembly decision and find a path around its most absolute consequences. What the tablets make clear is that Enki did not break the decree. He honored it in its letter while working around it in its effect. And the instrument of his workaround was a reed wall and a whisper. He did not speak directly to Utnapishtim, called Ziusudra in the older Sumerian versions, the man chosen to survive, the one whose piety and relationship with the divine had made him visible to Enki's attention in a way that the rest of humanity, in the noise of its accumulation, apparently had not. He spoke to the reed wall of the man's house. He addressed his message to the wall, which was technically not the man, and the man who was listening on the other side of the wall heard what the wall was told. And the distinction between speaking to a man and speaking to a wall in his presence was the gap in the decree's language that Enki had found and moved through with his characteristic precision. The message through the wall was practical. Tear down your house and build a boat. The dimensions were specified. The materials were specified. The caulking with bitumen was specified. The provisions to be loaded were specified. The animals, the family, the craftspeople, and their skills that would be needed to rebuild the world that was about to be covered. The instruction had the quality of all of Enki's interventions. It was technically complete, leaving nothing to improvisation, designed to achieve its outcome within the constraints that the assembly's decision had established. The flood lasted 7 days and 7 nights in some versions of the account, and considerably longer in others. The Atrasis epic gives it 7 days. The Babylonian flood narrative embedded in the Gilgamesh cycle extends it, and the tablets are more interested in its character than its duration. What they preserve is the silence of it. A flood that covered the plain entirely, left nothing above the water to produce sound, no wind against a surface, no current against a bank, only the water moving in the absence of everything that had made noise, and the sky above it equally silent. The storm that produced it had ended. The rain had stopped. The world was water and silence, and the gray light of days in which the distinction between the sky and the surface of the water was a matter of degree rather than kind. On the boat, the animals were the sound of the world that remained, the particular sounds of creatures confined in a space smaller than they would have chosen, the sounds of feeding and breathing and the restlessness of things that would normally have been moving across much larger distances. These sounds were the world's inventory, reduced to what the boat contained, and the man who had built the boat and loaded it and stood on its deck through the days of water and silence understood that the sounds around him were all that remained of the sound that had disturbed Enlil's sleep, the full noise of a civilization compressed to this, the breath of a goat, the movement of a bird against its enclosure, the creak of the hull as the water shifted beneath it. The birds were sent out in sequence, a dove first, which found no resting place and returned, a swallow, which found no resting place and returned, finally a raven, which found something, a resting place, a surface above the water, the beginning of the emerged world, and did not return. The non-return of the raven was the sign. The water had receded far enough somewhere for the raven to land and remain, which meant the world was beginning to exist again in the form that required solid ground rather than the form it had held for the days of the flood. The first sacrifice on the emerged land, the offering built on the mountaintop where the boat had grounded, the meat burned over the cedar wood that the man had brought in his provisions specifically for this moment, the smoke rising from the first fire lit on the returned earth, produced a smell that traveled upward from the emerged land into the sky above it, and the gods came down to it the way the tablets said, like flies over the sacrifice. The image is precise and deliberate and not at all heroic. The gods who had decreed the flood and watched it execute its purpose were drawn to the first post-flood offering by the same attraction that draws flies to something warm and nourishing, and the image acknowledges what the flood's consequence had been for the gods themselves. The silence of the covered plain had been the silence of the empty offering tables, and the gods who required the offerings that the humans produced had sat through 7 days of silence and absence, and the particular privation of divine beings who depended on the human world's functioning for the maintenance of their own. Enlil arrived at the sacrifice and found Utnapishtim alive and was angry. The decree had been total. The decree had been the assembly's sanction. The man's survival was a violation of the decree's intent, even if it was technically within the decree's letter, and Enlil's anger at finding the violation after the fact, after the flood had been endured, after the sacrifice had been made, after the gods had gathered around the smell of the offering, was the anger of a god who had been outmaneuvered by a colleague within the rules of a system they both operated inside. Enki's response to Enlil's anger was the response of a god who had anticipated the anger and had his argument prepared. He did not defend the violation by denying it. He redirected the argument. The flood had been the wrong instrument to begin with, excessive in relation to the problem, capable of destroying the innocent along with the guilty. If the noise of humanity had been the problem, there were less absolute solutions: a lion, a wolf, a famine, a plague, instruments of reduction that would not have required the erasure of everything. The flood had been Enlil's instrument, and it had been Enlil's excess, and the survival of one man was a correction applied to that excess by a colleague who had found the space within the decree that the decree's own overreach had created. The argument was not won and lost in the tablet's account. What happened was a resolution. Enlil was moved by the argument, or moved by the fact of the sacrifice and the god's need for it. or moved by the evident intention of a man who had built what he was told to build and loaded what he was told to load and released the raven and made the offering at the first available moment. He approached the boat. He took Utnapishtim and his wife by the hand and brought them forward and knelt beside them and touched their foreheads and spoke the words that the tablets preserve as the conferral of immortality. Formerly Utnapishtim was mortal. Now Utnapishtim and his wife shall be as we the gods are, and they shall dwell at the mouth of the rivers. The mouth of the rivers was the edge of the world, the place where the Tigris and the Euphrates finally gave themselves to the sea, the southernmost point of the plain, the boundary between the managed world and what lay beyond it. To be placed there was to be placed at the furthest remove from the center of human activity, while remaining within the world, to be set apart from ordinary human time while remaining in a location that could be reached with sufficient effort and sufficient reason by someone with a question that only the flood survivor could answer. The world that remained after the flood was the same world in a different world, the same in its geography. The rivers still descended from the mountains. The plain was still flat. The sky was still enormous above it. The reed beds at the southern edge were still dense and aromatic in the morning, different in its theology. A world that had been covered and returned was a world whose continuity could not be assumed with the same unreflective confidence that it had been assumed before. The flood had happened. The tablets that recorded it were widely copied, widely read, widely incorporated into the liturgical and educational traditions of every city on the plain for the 2,000 years that followed. The flood was part of the knowledge of what the world was, a world capable of being covered, capable of returning, dependent on the ongoing maintenance of a relationship between the human and the divine that could not be taken for granted and could not be allowed to become noise. The mountains that had been dark against the pale dawn sky had acquired color as the morning progressed, the brown-gray of exposed rock above the waterline, then the first green of vegetation appearing on the higher slopes where seeds had survived the water or where the birds that had nested there had returned. Below the waterline, the slopes were still submerged, still part of the plain of water that extended in every direction from the mountaintop where the boat rested. But above the waterline, the world was beginning its return, and the return was visible, and the man standing on the boat's deck watching the slopes acquire their color was watching the world demonstrate that it intended to continue. The water surface caught the morning light and held it flat, not the reflective surface of a calm canal in a managed city, but the vast, undifferentiated surface of a world covered, the light on it simply light, distributed evenly across a surface that extended to every horizon without interruption. A bird settled somewhere on the emerged slope above the waterline, settled and folded its wings and was still. Below it, the water continued to recede in increments too small to observe at any given moment, perceptible only across the span of hours, the waterline dropping against the rock face of the mountain by the width of a hand each day, then by the width of a forearm, then by the full length of an arm, then further, the plain beginning to re-emerge in the south where the land was flattest and the water was shallowest, the tops of the mounds where the cities had been appearing first, the cities themselves still buried under the silt the flood had carried and deposited, waiting to be found and cleared and rebuilt by the people who would come back to them when the water was low enough and the plain was firm enough for walking. The mountains remained. Their shapes against the sky were the same shapes they had always had, unchanged by what had passed below them. The morning continued its work of returning color to the world. The bird on the slope opened its wings once and folded them again and was still. Chapter 11. The House of Heaven's Foundation. The light moved across the interior wall of the house in the way that afternoon light moves when the sun has passed its zenith and begun its descent toward the western horizon. Not arriving but traveling, the pale rectangle of the window's outline shifting slowly across the plaster surface, climbing the wall at the angle the sun's position dictated, The shadow of the window frame, a precise record of the hour that anyone who had lived in this room for long enough could read without consulting any other instrument. The plaster was the color of dried river silt, pale ochre, slightly warm, the color of the plane itself brought inside and smoothed onto the mud brick surface. Where the light touched it directly, the plaster was the color of late honey. Where the shadow fell across it, the plaster was the color of something cooler and older. The difference between the two versions of the same surface significant enough to see, and slight enough to belong to the same continuous afternoon. A dust mote traveled through the shaft of light and was visible for the duration of its crossing and invisible before and after. The room held the warmth of mid-afternoon without being hot. The thick walls had absorbed the morning's heat and were releasing it slowly into the interior air, and the air itself was still, and the quality of the stillness was the quality of a room that had been inhabited for a long time by people who moved through it at the pace that the afternoon required. Babylon had existed before it became the center of the world. It had been a modest settlement on the Euphrates for centuries before the Old Babylonian period, a city among cities on the plain, holding no particular theological distinction and no special claim on the divine assembly's attention. What changed was the dynasty, the Amorite kings who came to power in Babylon in the early 2nd millennium BCE, of whom the sixth and most consequential was Hammurabi, who ruled for 42 years in the 18th century and brought under his administration a territorial extent that had not been unified under a single authority since the Akkadian Empire of Sargon 5 centuries earlier. Hammurabi's achievement was administrative as much as military. The famous law code, the stele of black diorite, 2.5 meters tall, inscribed with nearly 300 legal provisions, and discovered at Susa by French archaeologists in 1901, was not primarily a legal innovation. Most of the laws it contained had precedents in earlier Sumerian and Akkadian legal traditions, stretching back to Ur-Nammu's law code several centuries before. What Hammurabi's stele provided was a public statement of the principles under which the unified territory would be governed, inscribed in a form that could be copied and distributed across the cities of the plain and set up in their public spaces. The image of Hammurabi receiving the authority of law from Shamash the sun god at the stele's top, making the theological argument that the law's source was divine and its administration was a form of worship. The divine mandate that authorized Hammurabi's law code came from Anu and Enlil, and from the god whose rise was the theological expression of Babylon's political ascendancy, Marduk, city god of Babylon, son of Enki, a figure who had been a minor deity in the earlier tradition and who became, under the Babylonian synthesis, the lord of the divine assembly, the king of the gods, the figure whose authority superseded the authority of the older hierarchy without erasing it. The mechanism of Marduk's elevation was a text, the Enuma Elish, named for its opening words, meaning when on high, was the Babylonian creation epic, composed probably in the Old Babylonian period, though the earliest surviving complete versions came from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh nearly 1,000 years later. It was recited on the 4th day of the Babylonian New Year festival, the Akitu, in a ceremony that treated the recitation as an act of cosmological maintenance. The world renewed each year through the telling of how it was first made, the myth not merely describing the creation but participating in it, the words performing the reality they named. The Enuma Elish began where the Sumerian tradition began, with the primordial waters, the undifferentiated beginning, but named its primordial condition differently. In the beginning, when the sky above had not been named and the earth below had not been called by a name, there was Apsu, the sweet water, and Tiamat, the salt sea, and their waters were mingled together, and from their mingling the first gods were born. The sweet water and the salt sea commingling was a description of the estuarine environment of the southern plain, where the Tigris and Euphrates met the Persian Gulf, and the fresh water and the salt water mixed in the brackish channels of the delta, a cosmological origin story rooted in the specific geography of the civilization that produced it. The younger gods born from the commingling were noisy. They disturbed Apsu's rest, the same complaint that Enlil would later make about humanity, the theology returning to its structural concern about the relationship between the generated and the generators, between the created and the creating, between the noise of the new and the requirement for order that the old insisted upon. Apsu wanted to destroy the younger gods. Tiamat resisted. The salt sea was less certain than the sweet water that destruction was the appropriate response, and her hesitation gave the younger gods time to learn of the plan and to act on their knowledge. Enki, called Ea in the Akkadian tradition, the same god in a different language's keeping, moved first. He composed a spell, a sleep-inducing incantation, and cast it over Apsu, and Apsu sank into the deep sleep that the spell produced, and Enki killed him while he slept and established his own dwelling over Apsu's body, the freshwater deep now Ea's domain, the Apsu now the place where Ea lived and from which his wisdom operated. This was a gentler cosmological violence than the battle that followed, a solution by intelligence rather than by force, the god of craft and magic achieving through a spell what a warrior would have achieved through combat, and achieving it cleanly without the collateral consequences that combat tended to produce. Tiamat's response to Apsu's death took time. She gathered her forces, the monsters she had made for the purpose, the primordial creatures she had brought into being from the salt sea's generative capacity, 11 of them named in the Enuma Elish, with a specificity that suggests they were not invented for this text, but drawn from an older bestiary of divine monsters that the Babylonian tradition had inherited and organized. At the head of her forces, she placed Kingu, her new consort, whom she invested with the Tablet of Destinies, the divine record that conferred supreme authority on its holder, and sent against the younger gods. The younger gods were afraid. Their fear was specific and honest. The Enuma Elish does not attempt to make the divine assembly heroic in its initial response to Tiamat's mobilization, but describes a series of approaches to the problem that failed, gods sent to deal with Tiamat who returned without having dealt with her, the assembly unable to find among its existing members the figure capable of meeting Tiamat's forces in battle. The fear of the divine assembly was the narrative necessity that created the space for Marduk's emergence. A space defined by the inadequacy of all other options, a space that required exactly the qualities Marduk possessed. Marduk was the son of Ea, born in the Apsu, raised in the freshwater deep. The Enuma Elish described his birth with an attention to detail that signaled his importance. His double, triple, quadruple divinity, his 4 eyes and 4 ears, his lips moving fire, his physical presence so large and bright that even his divine parents were awed by what they had made. He was the god of 50 names. The Enuma Elish's final section, a catalog of those names and their meanings, each name a different aspect of his authority, the accumulation of them the theological argument for his supremacy. He offered to face Tiamat. His condition was the condition of a delegate rather than a servant. If he won, the assembly would confirm his supremacy, not just for the duration of the crisis, but permanently, not just in the specific domain that had been assigned by the primordial lottery, but over the entire divine order, Marduk above Anu, above Enlil, above all the older gods who had held their positions since the separation of heaven from earth. The assembly agreed. The agreement was made in the proper form, the assembly confirming Marduk's authority with the formal declaration that his word would be law, that what he decreed would stand, the test of this authority being demonstrated by a piece of cloth that the assembly caused to vanish and then caused to return at Marduk's command. The cloth vanished, the cloth returned, the assembly's confirmation was spoken. Marduk went to meet Tiamat. The battle is not rendered here in the kinetic register that the Enuma Elish's original poetry employs with considerable force, the winds that Marduk drove into Tiamat's open mouth, the net he cast, the lance he drove into her distended body. What this telling takes from the battle is its aftermath, the consequence that the cosmological tradition considered more significant than the moment of victory, what Marduk made from what he had defeated. From Tiamat's body he constructed the world. He split her in half the way a dried fish is split, the tablet's own image, domestic and precise. And from one half he made the sky, and from the other half he made the earth. From her eyes he caused the Tigris and the Euphrates to flow, which was the Babylonian tradition's explanation for the rivers that the Sumerian tradition had simply accepted as features of the existing world. From her ribs he arched the vault of heaven. From her tail he bent into the sky the band of stars. From Kingu's blood, the blood of the general she had invested with the Tablet of Destinies, and who was now defeated and held, Marduk made the clay from which humanity was fashioned, a different clay than the Sumerian tradition's clay, but clay still, and the blood of a defeated divine soldier still, the creation of humanity retold through the Babylonian cosmological frame, while preserving the structural logic that the Sumerian original had established. The Tablet of Destinies, taken from Kingu and given to Anu, was the administrative transfer of supreme authority to its proper new location. The divine assembly confirmed what the battle had established. Marduk's elevation was complete. Babylon was the city that received the theological consequence of this elevation. If Marduk was now the lord of the divine assembly, the king of the gods, then Babylon, Marduk's city, was the earthly headquarters of the divine order, the place on the plane where the highest divine authority had its permanent address. The Asagila, Marduk's great temple at Babylon, whose name meant the house whose head is high, was the earthly counterpart of the assembly hall in the sky, the place where the divine order was most directly accessible to the human world below. The ziggurat attached to the Asagila was called Etamananki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, and it was very large. The dimensions preserved in the tablets give it a square base of roughly 90 meters on each side, rising through 7 terraces to a shrine room at the top that stood approximately 90 meters above the plain. It was the largest structure on the Mesopotamian plain and possibly the largest in the ancient world during the period of its full construction under the Neo-Babylonian kings of the 7th and 6th centuries BCE. It was visible from a great distance across the flat land, a vertical presence in the most relentlessly horizontal landscape in the ancient world, its 7 terraces stepping back as they rose. The whole structure described in the records of the Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Babylon in the 5th century BCE, and whose account of the ziggurat, though filtered through a foreigner's perspective and a different tradition's categories, preserved something of the impression that the structure made on those who approached Babylon across the plain and saw it rising above the city long before the city itself came into view. The afternoon light in the room had traveled further across the plaster wall. The warm rectangle of it had climbed from the lower wall to the middle register, and the dust that the room's air contained was visible in the shaft for a moment, and then invisible as the angle shifted, the dust always present, always moving, the visibility of it dependent entirely on the light's position. The room was unchanged in its fundamental character. The same plaster, the same mud brick beneath it, the same quality of stillness that the thick walls produced, but the light's position was different from what it had been, and the difference was the afternoon's only argument that time had continued. The shadow line of the window frame had reached the far edge of the wall it had been crossing. The room went into a cooler, more diffuse light as the direct shaft moved off the plaster, and the indirect light of the afternoon filled the space without the particular warmth that the shaft had carried. The plaster was still the same pale ochre. The mud brick behind it was still the same dried river clay that it had always been. The room held its temperature and its quiet, the afternoon outside doing what it always did at this hour, declining toward the softer register of the late afternoon, the light losing its edge, the shadows losing their contrast, the day moving through the last of its direct illumination toward the long, diffuse, amber-tinted hour before dusk. In that hour, the ziggurat's shadow, if there was a ziggurat in this telling, would be very long across the plain. It would extend eastward across the flat land in a line that the eye could follow for a considerable distance before the shadow's edges dissolved into the general dimming of the day. And the ziggurat itself, catching the low western light on its western face, would be warm and golden and absolutely still against the sky that was beginning in its own slow way to prepare for what came after. Chapter 12. Gilgamesh at the Water's Edge. Gilgamesh had not yet understood what Enkidu's death meant. He understood absence, and he understood the silence that enters a room where a familiar body no longer answers. But he did not yet understand that the order of his life had already broken, and that no king's strength, no wall of fired brick, no cedar door, no favor once enjoyed from the gods could set it back in place again. He sat beside the body in Uruk and would not let the burial proceed, and the old poem tells this with a restraint that makes it heavier, not lighter. He remained there through the first stillness, and the second, through the hours in which grief still imagines that what has gone might turn back, and only when the body itself began to say what all flesh says in time, did he yield to what had already happened. That refusal, so bare on the tablet, has always been one of the poem's deepest places, because it is not heroic, and it is not wise, and it does not pretend to be either. It is only human, in the full Mesopotamian sense of that word, a creature built for labor and longing, for friendship and noise and appetite, and then for loss. Long before later readers would call the Gilgamesh poem a masterpiece, the people who copied it knew they were preserving something unusually complete, a work in which kingship, wilderness, desire, sleep, flood, divine anger, city life, and the hard fact of death all rest beside one another without being forced into one lesson. In the standard Babylonian version associated with Sin-Liki Unini, probably compiled in the 2nd millennium BCE from older material, the story became what it has remained ever since, the nearest thing Mesopotamia left to a summit in literature. It is broad enough to contain myths older than itself, and intimate enough to pause beside one man who cannot bear to let his friend be taken away. Enkidu had entered Gilgamesh's life as a counterweight and a likeness at once, a being made to answer excess with force, and then to turn that force toward companionship. Before him, Gilgamesh had ruled Uruk with the heedless certainty of someone who has never yet been denied by the world. After him, the king had learned joy of a kind that cities do not bestow, the joy of being matched, interrupted, understood without ceremony, and drawn outward into the cedar forest, and into deeds that, whether wise or foolish, were done beside another breathing life. The death of Enkidu, therefore, was not merely bereavement. It was the removal of the witness before whom Gilgamesh had been most fully alive, and when that witness was gone, the king found that the glory of Uruk could not answer him. The poem allows grief only so much time before it begins its longer work. Mourning becomes fear, and fear becomes motion, and motion in Gilgamesh never remains inward for long. What he sees in Enkidu is not only the end of one beloved life, but the shape of his own end, waiting with a patience no rank can exhaust. The body on the bier becomes a mirror held at a terrible angle, and once he has seen himself there, he can no longer sit inside the city and call the walls sufficient. That is the beginning of the long road eastward and outward, away from the ordered brick of Uruk and toward the places where Mesopotamian imagination set its limits. Mountain passes, remote shores, the edge of the sea, and the mouth of the rivers where the flood survivor lives beyond ordinary reach. By then, the old stories were already layered. The Gilgamesh cycle did not spring into being complete. Sumerian poems had carried separate episodes centuries before the standard version gave them a single grave continuity, and what Sinlaki-Onini, or the tradition associated with his name, achieved was not invention in the simple sense, but arrangement of inherited depth. Older flood lore entered the arc of a grieving king. Divine geography, already ancient, was placed along the route of a human search. The wisdom literature of Mesopotamia, always practical beneath its grandeur, found room in an epic for tavern advice, for fatigue, for failed heroics, and for a final answer that strips immortality of all ornament. The result is a poem that feels vast because it contains not one vision of life, but many, held together by the pressure of a question that cannot be evaded. At evening, a traveler's hand comes to rest on the stone of a city gate. The stone is cooler than the air has been all afternoon, and smoother at that familiar height than the rougher blocks above and below, because many hands have paused there before moving on. Behind him there is a city that knows his name, the ordinary nearness of walls and roofs and vessels set down for the night. Ahead there is the open steppe, where the ground will keep its own counsel, and the dark will spread without interruption. The last of the western light is leaving the upper edges of the gate, and the first stars are beginning where the sky has already thinned to deeper blue, and for a little while the body knows exactly what the mind does not, that it is standing between one life and another, with no road back to the earlier one. Gilgamesh moves through that threshold in the poem with the desperation of someone who cannot yet imagine acceptance except as defeat. He crosses distances that exist partly in geography and partly in the old symbolic map of the world, and that doubleness matters. Mesopotamian literature often places wisdom at edges, at river mouths, at sea margins, at mountain thresholds, at the points where cultivated order thins and another order begins. To travel outward is therefore also to travel toward knowledge not available in the center. Yet the poem is too honest to let the journey become pure revelation. The farther he goes, the more thoroughly he carries himself with him, his fear, his exhaustion, and the royal habit of pressing on after the thing that cannot be possessed by pressing. It is along this outer margin that he comes to Siduri, the tavern keeper, a figure whose quietness has outlasted much louder characters. Later ages have remembered gods of storm and kings who built walls, but Siduri remains at the edge of the sea with a wisdom more durable than force. In some versions, she speaks with care that is almost maternal, and in others with the practical calm of someone who has watched many travelers arrive bearing the same impossible wish. She tells him, in words among the gentlest ancient literature has kept, that the life he seeks to preserve forever is the life he is presently failing to inhabit. Eat, drink, let your belly be full. Look at the child who takes your hand. Let your wife delight in your embrace. This too is the share of humankind. There is no mockery in her counsel, and no glittering riddle. That is part of what makes the scene so beautiful. Siduri does not offer a hidden gate through the structure of mortality, nor does she pretend that grief can be argued into submission. She offers proportion. The lot of humankind is not eternal youth, not unbroken companionship, not the keeping of all things once loved, but the inhabiting of the life available while it remains available. In a literature so often concerned with divine decrees and cosmic distances, this advice arrives close to the ground. Food, touch, marriage, children, the ordinary completions of a day. The poem lets Gilgamesh hear her and continue anyway, because hearing wisdom is not the same thing as being ready to live by it. Beyond Siduri lie the waters of death, one of those images through which Mesopotamian thought gives boundary a physical form. They are not merely dangerous water in the practical sense, though water always had practical danger enough in that world. They are the separating element, the thing between the human seeker and the one man who has escaped the common end. To cross them is to pass out of the ordinary economy of labor and burial into a region that no healthy life is meant to inhabit for long. That Gilgamesh crosses them at all tells us how far grief has already carried him from the measures of ordinary human prudence. He wants an answer, and he wants it in the form of exception. At the mouth of the rivers he finds Utnapishtim, flood survivor and old recipient of divine favor, living in the distance where myth places those whom history can no longer contain. By bringing Gilgamesh to him, the poem joins two of Mesopotamia's most enduring questions: how the flood once remade the world, and whether death can be evaded by the one who understands enough. Utnapishtim's presence widens the epic beyond personal sorrow into civilizational memory. The flood story itself enters here not as a decorative inset, but as proof that the cosmos has once already been broken and reset, and that divine decisions do not usually move according to human fairness. If there is a secret of survival, it belongs to a singular past event, not to a path others may simply follow. That is why Utnapishtim's answer matters so much. He does not hand over immortality as a reward for courage, because courage is not the measure by which such things are given. He demonstrates instead that the distinction Gilgamesh has come seeking to erase still stands. In some recensions he tests him through sleep, the most modest and most devastating of human defeats, and Gilgamesh fails there as all people fail, not dramatically but by yielding to the body's own law. Even then the poem permits one more movement of hope. There is from the deep a plant that renews. It grows from the bottom of the waters, difficult to reach and real enough to hold. Gilgamesh goes down for it and rises with it in his hand. The moment is handled with extraordinary care because it is not quite triumph and not yet loss. Gilgamesh speaks of taking the plant back to Uruk, of testing it, of sharing renewal rather than hoarding it in the blind manner of a tyrant. Whether this is growth or merely a more generous form of the same old desire, the poem leaves suspended for a little while. What matters is that he has found something that appears to answer the ache that drove him across the world. The road home begins under that thin and improbable promise. And for the first time since Enkidu's death, the movement of the story softens, as though it too would like to believe that a human hand might carry restoration safely home. But the old poems do not often confuse possession with security. At a pool along the way, Gilgamesh stops to bathe, and while he sleeps, a serpent comes to the plant, takes it, and sheds its skin as it goes. The image is so spare that it scarcely seems to announce itself, and yet almost nothing in ancient literature is more complete. The serpent does not argue, or threaten, or explain. It renews itself by leaving its old skin behind, and the man who sought renewal wakes to find that the thing he won through ordeal has passed from his keeping without struggle. The serpent goes on, the skin remains. The loss is finished before grief has even found its full shape. In that economy lies the whole answer. Renewal belongs to the serpent, or to the gods, or to the recurrent life of the world, but not in the same way to the mortal king who wanted to outrun the common law. Gilgamesh, sitting beside the water, weeps for the plant and for himself and for the journey that has brought him so far, only to return him to the truth spoken much earlier by the woman at the tavern's edge. Mortality was not waiting at the end of the road as a hidden punishment. It had been there from the beginning, woven into food and marriage, labor and friendship, walls and sleep. The search for an answer beyond that order has cost him almost everything except the chance to see it clearly. And so he returns to Uruk, not immortal, not comforted in the soft sense, but altered by the failure of his refusal. The city he left in panic becomes visible again in another proportion. Its walls still stand, its gates still turn on their sockets. Its brickwork still gathers the light of late day and gives it back more softly toward evening. The poem closes not with transcendence but with re-entry, the human king restored to the human city, where making, measuring, ruling, and remembering are the things available in place of eternity. That is why the epic has lasted. It does not deny the grandeur of the wish to live forever, but it refuses to flatter it. It lets the wish travel to the end of the world and come home empty-handed, except for understanding. By the pool, the water keeps the last movement of what has happened a little longer than the mind can bear to watch. The ripples spread outward in widening circles, each one thinner than the one before, until they reach the stone edge and fold against it without sound. A few smaller rings cross the larger ones, then flatten. The surface darkens as the light lowers. The last of the disturbance touches the border of the pool and disappears, and after that the water is still. Chapter 13. The Shore of Dilmun. From the search for immortality came, at last, a return to what had already been there, not in the sense that Gilgamesh himself arrived at peace and then turned aside into some easier understanding, but in the larger sense that Mesopotamian literature had already imagined another answer to the same old human ache. If the long road to Utnapishtim had shown that immortality was not available to the king who pursued it across the edges of the world, the older vision of Dilmun suggested that there were other ways to imagine a life untroubled by decay, other ways to set rest against the ordinary conditions of mortal existence. The difference is quiet but important. Gilgamesh seeks exemption and fails. Dilmun does not depict a hero escaping death. It depicts a world in which the conditions that give rise to such a search have for a little while been absent from the beginning. That is why Dilmun feels so unlike later paradise traditions that depend on splendor, hierarchy, or reward. In the Sumerian imagination, it is not rendered primarily through ornament or through crowds of blessed figures singing in some perfected brightness. It is rendered through negation, through the patient removal of what normally burdens life. The lion does not kill. The wolf does not seize the lamb. The sick man does not say that he is sick. The old woman does not say that she is an old woman. The old man does not say that he is an old man. Sorrow is not overcome by triumph here. It is simply not entered. The result is not excitement, and not even joy in the ordinary sense, but a kind of stillness that rests more deeply than joy does, because nothing in it is straining against its opposite. This negative theology gives Dilmun a remarkable texture. Most ancient sacred landscapes are described by what they contain: rivers, trees, palaces, divine beings, metals, radiance, song. Dilmun is remembered at least as much for what it lacks. It lacks complaint. It lacks infirmity. It lacks predation. It lacks the spoken evidence of age. In that way, it comes very close to the structure of longing itself, because human beings often imagine peace not first as an accumulation of pleasures, but as the removal of the thing that has been hurting them. The weary person thinks first of quiet, the grieving person of the end of pain, the frightened person of safety, the sick person of relief. Dilmun belongs to that register. It is paradise as the suspension of affliction, not paradise as spectacle. And yet it is not empty. The old texts place it to the east and south, associated in later thinking with the Gulf and with distant coastal richness, and even when geography and myth part company, the imaginative setting remains one of fertility near the water's edge. Dilmun is bright, watered, cultivated, held in order. It belongs to the family of places where abundance is maintained rather than seized, where divine care is less visible as drama than as successful arrangement. That makes it especially suitable for a chapter in which the greater gods recede a little and smaller divine presences begin to show themselves. A world kept free of sickness and predation would not be sustained by force alone. It would require innumerable lesser offices, lesser hands, lesser acts of attention, each one too small for epic, but not too small for existence. At noon, the heat in the garden is dry, though not severe in the way open ground can be severe when the sun stands high above the plain. Here it has been gathered and held by walls, warmed into stillness rather than sharpened into assault, and the body receives it differently for that reason. The light lies flat and white overhead. Somewhere beyond the first stand of leaves, water can be heard, not near enough to cool the skin, only near enough to be part of the air. There is the scent of something flowering that has no ready name, a sweetness held low and steady in the warmth, and under all of it the slower smell of earth that has been watered earlier and is now giving that water back by degrees. Nothing presses, nothing asks to be hurried. The body grows heavier in such air, not with fatigue exactly, but with a settling that makes movement seem less necessary than it did a little while before. The myth of Enki and Ninhursag unfolds in this landscape with the odd, luminous logic of many Sumerian narratives, where fertility, offense, creation, appetite, and healing can all belong to the same divine motion without ever needing to be forced into a single tidy lesson. Enki, god of sweet waters, craft, intelligence, and generative cunning, moves through Dilmun as a figure whose powers are inseparable from overflow. Ninhursag, associated with earth, mothering force, and the shaping capacities of fertile ground, stands beside him not merely as counterpart, but as the principle that gives form to growth. Their story in Dilmun is partly about abundance becoming disorder when it passes the bounds proper to it, and partly about disorder being turned back into ordered life through healing. The old poems do not always distinguish sharply between creation and cure, because in an agrarian and divine imagination those things are often neighbors. One of the central episodes turns on plants that Ninhursag has cultivated and Enki consumes. The act is less like theft in the later moralizing sense than like an untimely or improper taking into himself of what had been set in ordered growth. As a result, he is afflicted, and the affliction is distributed across 8 parts of his body. There follows anger, withdrawal, and then in time a return to healing. Ninhursag creates 8 goddesses, each corresponding to one injured place, each one a remedy shaped to the site of damage. This is one of the places where Mesopotamian myth comes nearest to a kind of anatomical tenderness. The divine body is not invulnerable abstraction. It can be hurt, it can require care. What restores it is not a single overwhelming act of power, but the generation of fitting responses, one for each wound. That pattern matters well beyond the immediate story. It suggests a theological world in which order is not maintained by grandeur alone, but by specificity. One pain belongs to one part. One cure belongs to one pain. The wounded body gives rise to a series of smaller divine persons, each with a defined office. And in that movement, the myth shades almost imperceptibly into the wider Mesopotamian habit of populating existence with powers attached to functions, thresholds, instruments, growth cycles, and states of matter. Great gods dominate the literary horizon because they anchor kingship, city identity, and cosmic structure, but the actual divine world imagined by Mesopotamian religion was much more crowded than the epics alone might suggest. Between heaven and field, between temple and storehouse, there were lesser presences enough to fill every remaining gap. The minor Anunnaki, and the many related lesser divine figures who cluster around the great old names, belong to that crowded middle distance. Some were attached to grain, some to tools, some to irrigation, some to the keeping of light or season, some to offices whose exact force is now dim because the texts that named them outlived the daily worlds that understood them perfectly. Ancient religion is rarely economical in this way. Once a civilization begins to think divinely with real seriousness, it tends to populate the world thickly. There can be a god for the pickaxe because the pickaxe matters. There can be a goddess of grain because grain stands between a city and hunger every year of its life. There can be a divine office so narrow that later ages almost smile at it, and yet to the people who lived inside that economy, the office would not have seemed narrow at all. It would have seemed accurate. In Dilmun, such lesser figures feel especially at home because paradise of this kind is administrative as much as it is beautiful. It is a place where right relation has been achieved and kept. Water arrives where it should. Growth continues without blight. Age does not speak in the body. Predation has been suspended. A place like that requires not only abundance but supervision, not in the stern sense of discipline, but in the softer sense of innumerable things, each remaining true to their function. That may be why the paradise landscape in Sumerian myth feels more cultivated than wild. Even its peace has a tended quality. It is not untouched nature. It is an order so complete that labor no longer advertises itself as labor. For that reason, the chapter moves more slowly than those organized around kings and quests. There is less event here and more condition. Enki is afflicted and healed, yes, and from his injured body further divine beings emerge, and the myth offers one of those old genealogical explanations by which offices, places, and sacred identities are given a beginning. But the deeper movement lies elsewhere. It lies in the thought that a world can be imagined where the ordinary frictions of mortal life have been lifted away, not by conquest, not by the exceptional success of one hero, but by proper tending at the level of the whole environment. Paradise in this Mesopotamian register is not a prize won. It is an ecology of care. There is something profoundly restful in that old idea, and also something slightly sad, because a place defined by the absence of sickness and age can only be imagined clearly by a people to whom sickness and age were familiar companions. The negations tell us what hurt. The old man does not say that he is old because in the ordinary world he often had to say so. The sick woman does not say that she is sick because in the ordinary world sickness named itself aloud and had to be reckoned with. Even paradise, therefore, carries the contour of the world outside it. Dilmun is not separate from suffering by ignorance. It is separate by contrast. It glows faintly because the rest of life did not. And still the old texts do not hurry to darken it. They let the place remain. They let the air hold its warmth. They let water continue somewhere just beyond sight. They let healing occur through fit correspondence rather than force. They let small gods keep their stations around the edges of the greater names. In that sense, Dilmun is one of the most generous landscapes Mesopotamian literature permits itself. It does not solve death the way Gilgamesh wished to solve it. It does something quieter. It imagines a realm in which life has not yet begun to fray, and in doing so, it offers not instruction exactly, but relief. The relief of a mental room where nothing has gone wrong yet, and where perhaps nothing needs to. That may be why the myth lingers so well in memory. Heroic journeys exhaust themselves. Battles pass. Floods recede. Even the search for immortality ends with a serpent moving off into reeds and stones, while a man sits beside empty water, but a garden held in still noon heat, where age has not yet entered speech, and each wound can still summon its own answer, remains in the mind differently. It does not urge forward. It does not demand interpretation. It rests there, available whenever thought has become too sharp and needs some older counterweight made of shade, water, and the absence of harm. At the center of the garden there is a single fig tree. Its leaves hold a small circle of shade on the hot ground below, and the earth inside that circle is a little darker than the earth beyond it, as though it belongs to another hour of the day. Outside the ring, the ground is pale and sunstruck. Inside it, the color deepens, and the difference is enough for the eye to keep returning to it. Nothing in the garden needs to move for the scene to feel complete. The heat remains where it has gathered. Water sounds somewhere behind the leaves. The shade keeps its place under the tree, and the darker ground within it rests there, cooler than the ground outside, and still. Chapter 14. The Dimming of the Gods. By the 7th century BCE, the old Mesopotamian tradition had already become deep enough to require curation as much as continuation. What Ashurbanipal gathered at Nineveh was not a handful of courtly texts, nor a king's private amusement, but the most comprehensive library of Mesopotamian mythological, ritual, scholarly, and omen literature that had ever been assembled in one place. In the rooms of his palace lay the standard version of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, the Atrahasis, hymns, prayers, incantations, lexical lists, omen series, ritual instructions, medical compilations, and the patient result of 2,000 years of scribal care. The consequence of such gathering was not merely prestige, it was concentration. Things once distributed across cities, temples, schools, and generations could now be held together within one royal archive, where the continuity of the old world became visible in shelves of clay. It is important not to imagine this enterprise as antiquarian in the later sense, as though Ashurbanipal had been a collector of curiosities admiring the past, because it was safely over. The palace library was assembled from a different conviction, one so old and so practical that it hardly separated religion from operation. The texts mattered because they worked. A hymn properly known, an omen correctly copied, a ritual accurately performed, a divine name written without damage or omission. All of these belonged to the maintenance of reality. Mesopotamian scholarship was never merely descriptive, it was participatory. To preserve the right words was to help preserve the right order of things, and that order extended from palace to temple, from liver omens to the motions of stars, from the naming of gods to the prospering of fields. That is why the scribal tradition deserves to be understood as a kind of devotion even when the tablet in question appears administrative, lexical, or technical. The scribe in Mesopotamia did not only record sacred power, he helped keep it in circulation. The act of copying was itself a form of maintenance, a reinscription of authority into matter. Every wedge impressed into wet clay renewed not the content alone, but the material chain through which content remained available to the world. If a text had once been potent, then its continued legibility mattered. If a ritual sequence had once aligned human action with divine expectation, then to preserve its wording was no small task. It was one of the ways a civilization kept faith with the structures that had carried it thus far. The colophons make this especially clear. At the end of many tablets come the brief, careful notes that modern readers sometimes pass over too quickly: the name of the scribe, the line of copying, the date, the king under whom the work was produced, the place to which the tablet belonged, the warning against theft or damage, the prayer that the tablet remain intact. These closing marks are small in scale but large in feeling. They treat the object not as a neutral container but as a thing whose physical survival matters in its own right. A tablet could be cursed if stolen, blessed if preserved, identified with its proper house, attached to the prestige of a learned line. It could be damaged and restored. It could be recopied because its old surface had begun to fail. All of this suggests a culture in which writing was not only information, but continuity in hardened earth. In that sense, Nineveh's library was the late monumental form of a much older habit. Long before Ashurbanipal, scribes had already been carrying Sumerian compositions into Akkadian worlds, reshaping inherited material without severing it, preserving hymns to gods whose cultic balance had changed, and copying stories whose oldest forms belonged to cities that were ancient even to them. Sin Laki Unini, remembered in connection with the standard Babylonian Gilgamesh, belongs to that long middle history. Whether as an individual compiler or as the name attached to a textual tradition, he stands for the fact that Mesopotamian literature endured through arrangement as much as through originality. The library at Nineveh, therefore, did not begin continuity. It revealed its full depth. It made visible how many centuries of handling, recopying, glossing, teaching, and reverent correction had already passed through the clay. In the last hours of afternoon, an archive has its own smell. Dried clay holds the room first, a mineral dryness that is older than paper and less yielding than wood, and beneath it there is the faint resinous note of cedar shelving and the darker trace of bitumen where some damaged edge has once been mended. Dust rests in the enclosed air without lifting much, and because the room has not moved its breath quickly, the scents remain layered rather than dispersed. Light enters low and warm, not strong enough now to make the wedges easy to read at a glance, only enough to bring their surfaces forward as texture. Each cuneiform impression casts a tiny shadow. The tablets are not yet dark, but they are on their way to darkness, and in that angled light they look less like messages than like worked earth waiting to be touched. What fell in 612 BCE, when Nineveh was taken and the Assyrian center broken, was therefore more than a city and more than a palace. It was also one of the greatest concentrations of written tradition the ancient Near East had ever produced. Yet even here it is worth being careful with tone. The familiar temptation is elegy, burning roofs, shattered rooms, knowledge scattered into rubble. And some of that happened plainly enough. Tablets were broken, shelves collapsed, rooms burned. The arrangement made by human custody came apart under war, as so many arrangements do. But clay is not parchment, and fired collapse can preserve what it seems to destroy. Many tablets survived precisely because the roofs fell, because the rooms sealed, because earth and ruin held what they covered until another age would uncover it. The dispersal at Nineveh was thus not simple annihilation. It was translation into burial. Texts that had once lived by circulation entered a long second life by stillness. Hidden under debris, they ceased to function as active instruments in a royal scarly world, but they did not cease to exist. The myths were no longer being performed in that place. The omen series no longer consulted by those shelves. The hymns no longer taken down by a living hand at dusk. And yet the clay endured in another mode of preservation altogether. It is one of the strange mercies of Mesopotamian material culture that collapse often made memory portable through time. What no one could continue in practice could still remain in form. After the Persian conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE, and through the Greek and Parthian centuries that followed, the cuneiform tradition did not vanish at once. Contraction is the more accurate word. The number of trained scribes narrowed. The domains in which cuneiform remained useful became smaller and more specialized. Local temples and learned circles still copied, calculated, observed, and preserved. But the broad civilizational fabric that had once sustained writing in this form grew thinner with each generation. Languages shifted, political centers changed. New scripts served new administrations more efficiently. The old wedge writing, so perfectly adapted to its own long world, remained standing for a while in smaller rooms as the larger house around it was remodeled beyond recognition. This thinning matters because endings in history are seldom singular. There was no one day on which someone set down a stylus and announced that the gods of Sumer and Akkad had gone quiet forever. Instead, there were fewer apprentices, fewer houses of copying, fewer patrons for old literatures, fewer eyes able to move across the signs with ease. A script can remain alive long after it has ceased to be ordinary, and then one day it is no longer lived in but remembered only by the last specialists. Sometime in the 1st century CE, the last known cuneiform tablet was written. That moment is moving not because it was dramatic, but because it almost certainly was not. Somewhere, in air no different from the air of any other day, a hand completed a text in a script whose chain of living readers was nearing its end. After that, cuneiform and the languages it encoded withdrew beyond ordinary human reach. The tablets remained, but the sounds bound into them did not. Sign by sign, line by line, an entire written world became opaque. The gods were still present in clay, but no longer in the immediate sense of a hymn recited correctly or a myth copied for use. They had become fixed in matter and removed from living speech. It would be easy to call this disappearance, yet even that word is not quite right. The writings had not disappeared. They had become silent in a particular way, waiting not for worship exactly, and not even for reverence, but for decipherment, for the slow return of relation between mark and meaning. When that return began in the 19th century, it did not restore the old cults or reopen the original ritual worlds. It performed a different labor. Excavation brought buried tablets into light again, and decipherment gave back their voices not to temple singers or palace scholars, but to archaeologists, philologists, historians, and then to everyone else who would eventually inherit the translated result. What had once been operational necessity became historical legibility. What had once been kept because the world functioned better if it were kept could now be preserved because the human past became fuller when it was heard again. The mode changed. The chain did not break. The myths became portable in a new way. That is why this chapter resists lament. To say that the gods dimmed is not to say they were extinguished. They changed medium. Once they had moved through ritual precision, through temple memory, through the authority of recited names and correctly copied incantations. Later they would move through excavation reports, museum drawers, grammars, sign lists, transliterations, translations, and the long patient work by which forgotten languages are made audible again. Each age preserves according to its own tools. Mesopotamia preserved first by continuance, then by burial, then by decipherment. The old divine names endured all three stages. They were never required to remain in only one form. So the end of the living scribal tradition can be understood as completion rather than loss. The clay had always been the crucial thing. Clay received the stylus, kept the pressure of the hand, survived fire better than many more delicate substances, and could pass from one century into another with almost unreasonable patience. When the speaking communities thinned, the tablets did not ask for grief. They asked only for time. In that patience there is something very close to the old Mesopotamian sense of order itself. Not immortality in the heroic sense, not escape from change, but persistence through transformation. The gods became permanently portable in the objects that bore them. Their stories could wait longer than empires could rule. And in waiting, they acquired a final kind of durability the first scribes could never quite have intended, though they might have recognized its logic. A tablet copied in Nineveh under Ashurbanipal, or in Babylon under another king, or in some later temple school under narrowing circumstances, could outlast the palace that stored it, the language that read it, the dynasty that dated it, and the ritual frame that gave it immediate use. It could then re-enter the world under other lights and in other rooms, carrying not exactly the same power, but something continuous enough that we still call it by the same names. Gilgamesh remains Gilgamesh. Enuma Elish remains a creation poem. Inanna, Marduk, Nana, Enki, and the Anunnaki still cross the mind because clay once held them fast. A clay tablet lies on a shelf in the last of the afternoon light. The surface that was legible a few moments ago has begun to go dark, not because anything in it has changed, but because the light is withdrawing from the room in slow measure. The wedge impressions are still there, each one where the stylus left it, unchanged in the hard clay. As the warm edge of day slips lower, the signs lose their small shadows one by one. Readable or unreadable, attended or unattended, they remain in place. The words do not move. The light goes. The tablet stays. Chapter 15. The Long Quiet After. What remained, after all the revisions and recopyings and reorderings, was not a single doctrine held unchanged against time, but a civilization's habit of returning to the same deep questions without ever requiring that the answers remain in one form. Creation could be retold. The flood could be placed inside a king's grief. A god once central in one city could become secondary in another without being erased. A hymn could survive the cultic balance that first gave it urgency. A myth could move from temple use into schoolroom copying, from living recitation into burial beneath a fallen wall, from burial into museum glass, and still remain recognizably itself. That is the patience at the heart of the Mesopotamian tradition. Not rigidity, not pure continuity, but a willingness to revise and reframe without discarding what earlier ages had already made. For nearly 3,000 years, the peoples of the land between the rivers kept up that conversation. They asked how the world began and how order had first been separated from confusion. They asked why floods come, why kings rise, why cities require walls, why the dead cannot return, why the gods are near in one season and difficult in another. They asked these things in Sumerian and Akkadian, through hymns and omens, through rituals and lexical lists, through epics that had already grown old by the time later scribes took them up again. Their answers changed because the cities changed, because empires pressed new shapes onto the old plane, because local gods had to learn coexistence with imperial gods, because suffering does not hold still, and because language itself drifts. Yet the questions remained, and in remaining they gave the whole tradition its long inner coherence. There is something unusually humane in that persistence. A culture that returns again and again to creation, flood, mortality, and divine will, is not merely rehearsing old material. It is measuring each new century against the same horizon. The world begins, then must be ordered again. The waters rise, then recede, then remain in memory long after the mud has dried. A friend dies and grief sends a king beyond the edge of what can be known. Paradise is imagined not as reward but as the suspension of injury. The gods diminish in public life and then continue in clay. None of these movements cancels the others. They accumulate, and because they accumulate without haste, the tradition comes to feel less like a sequence of disconnected texts than like one very long act of thought. That long act was never carried only by kings or by the most famous names. We have spent time with An and Enlil, with Inanna and Enki, with Utnapishtim and Gilgamesh, with Ashurbanipal and the scribes who placed their careful marks at the edge of tablets. But the tradition itself was sustained just as much by the unnamed copyist, the temple singer, the apprentice learning signs in dust and clay, the reader who recognized an old hymn inside a newer arrangement and chose not to let it go. Civilizations often appear to modern eyes through monuments and rulers because stone and conquest are easy to notice. Yet the quieter truth is that most cultural endurance comes from repeated acts of maintenance, many of them humble, almost all of them temporary when taken one by one. Mesopotamia understood that better than most, perhaps because life on the alluvial plain itself required unending maintenance if anything was to remain inhabitable for long. The plain taught the lesson first. Water had to be guided. Banks had to be watched. Fields had to be measured, repaired, and resown. Brick had to be remade from the same earth that flood or neglect could soften back toward formlessness. There was no illusion in such a place that order, once achieved, would sustain itself indefinitely. That may be one reason the myths are so patient with remaking. They arise from a landscape where stability is never a permanent gift, only a repeated accomplishment. Creation itself in such a world cannot be thought as a single finished act. It has to resemble irrigation, repair, recitation, copying, seasonal return. Even the gods seem to inhabit that rhythm. They are not static ideals. They are powers repeatedly arranged into relevance by the societies that call on them. Wind crosses a barley field at the end of harvest season. The sound reaches first, before the movement itself becomes visible. a dry passing over the stalks, beginning at one edge and moving in a low wave toward the other. The field answers all at once and then by degrees, as though one section had spoken and the next had taken it up a little later, until the whole breadth of it has become a single shifting surface under the evening sky. Gold remains close to the horizon. Above it there is orange, and above that the first cooler blue of dusk beginning to gather its own stillness. The sound passes on without hurry. The stalks settle where they were standing before, and for a moment after the wind has gone, the field seems to remember it in silence. That is close to the quality the whole tradition leaves behind. Not resolution, because Mesopotamian literature is rarely interested in wrapping its great subjects neatly. Not closure, because flood and death and divine distance are not subjects that close. What it leaves is something more like the field after wind, or the archive after light, or the pool after ripples. The sense that motion has passed through a thing and altered it without destroying its basic form. The old myths have moved through many shapes, and their surfaces are marked by each passage. Sumerian poems become Akkadian epics. City cults become imperial theology. Liturgical use becomes scholarly preservation. Burial becomes rediscovery. But through all those changes, there remains a recognizable stillness at the center. An old concern with how life is made, threatened, repaired, and remembered. When the tablets sit now in museums or collections, in drawers and cases far from the river mud that first gave them matter, they do not appear as they once appeared to the people who made them. Their worlds are partially gone. The rooms that knew their proper use are gone. The languages had to be recovered. The gods are no longer invoked there with the expectation that the harvest, the king, or the omens will answer differently if the text is neglected. And yet something essential has not been lost. The clay still carries pressure from the hand. The wedges still cast shadows. The arrangement of signs still preserves the shape of ancient concern. A museum is not a temple school, but it is still a place where a civilization can wait in matter for another pair of eyes. To look at a tablet now is therefore to stand at an unusual distance from human continuity. One sees at once how much has ended and how much has remained available despite ending. The person who first impressed those signs into wet clay could not have imagined every later reader, every translation, every scholarly dispute, every quiet visitor pausing before glass. But they knew enough of duration to ask for the tablet's preservation. They knew enough to name a king, a date, a line of copying, and to hope the object would remain intact. In that hope, they were already sending it forward. Not toward us in particular, because history does not know its future readers so clearly, but toward whoever might still be able to receive the trace. That forwardness is one of the most touching things in ancient writing. It does not promise immortality. It asks only to last a little longer. And the land itself remains, in its own way, a larger tablet beneath all the others. The alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates has outlived the languages that once named every canal and gate with perfect local confidence. Evening still gathers there whether or not anyone recites a hymn to mark it. Water still catches the last light in channels natural and made. The low mounds that were once cities still rise from the flat distance, not monumental in the later imperial sense, but persistent, holding shape because human habitation once pressed the earth and left it slightly higher than the fields around it. A ziggurat mound at a distance does not declare itself loudly. It rests in the horizon like a memory the land has not entirely surrendered. That is perhaps the proper way to think of the long quiet after. Not as absence, not as a silence that proves something failed. It is quieter than the centuries of active worship, certainly, and quieter than the schoolrooms in which apprentices once learned the signs. Quieter than the palace archives and temple courtyards. But quiet is not the same as emptiness. The conversation has changed medium. It no longer continues through routine offering or through the administrative life of sacred texts. It continues through endurance, through scholarship, through reading, through the simple fact that the old questions still seem worth asking when we encounter them in clay. What is creation? What survives the flood? What can be repaired? How should a mortal life be lived? Why do the gods, or whatever replaces the gods in later thinking, remain both near and difficult to understand? Mesopotamia never offered final answers to those questions because no civilization really can. What it offered was continuity of attention. That may be the greater gift, to keep looking at the same mysteries for millennia without exhausting them, without declaring them closed, without discarding earlier answers simply because later ones speak differently. That is a form of intellectual mercy as much as achievement. It allows human thought to age without becoming sterile. It allows old stories to become wiser by being retold in altered circumstances. It allows the dead to remain in conversation with the living, not through doctrine imposed intact, but through inherited forms of wondering. So the chapter does not end in a museum case, though the tablets remain there, nor in a ruined city, though the mounds remain there too. It ends by pulling back toward the plain itself, where the first materials of the whole tradition still gather in their older order: earth, water, distance, evening, cultivated ground, the slow lowering of light. In such a place, the grandeur of the myths becomes secondary to their rhythm. One can almost feel, more than understand, why these stories took the shape they did. A land that must be maintained teaches maintenance. A horizon so open teaches scale. Water that can nourish or erase teaches reverence. Evening over flat ground teaches that rest is not a conclusion imposed from outside, but a condition the world enters on its own when the day's work has receded far enough. The field is quiet now. The wind has gone on to some other part of the plain, and the barley stalks stand still where they were left, no longer answering anything. The last of the evening settles over them in a soft, even layer. Beyond them, the water keeps a faint line of light a little longer, and farther still the old mounds remain visible across the distance, low and patient under the deepening sky. Nothing announces an ending. The field does not close. The plain does not speak. The light lowers, the stalks remain still, and the quiet after rests over them all. Chapter 16. What the Tablets Remember. The field remains where it was, and the quiet remains over it a little longer than the eye expects. The stalks no longer move. The line of water beyond them holds the last of the light, and then lets it go. And after that, the plain begins to pass into evening more completely. Not all at once, but in small softenings, a distance less distinct, a color less certain. The low shapes of old mounds settling into the land that holds them. Nothing has been taken away. The world has only grown gentler in the hour after day. And from there, the view seems to draw back without effort. The plain widens first, becoming less a field than a breadth of earth held between the rivers, flat and old and patient under the darkening sky. The watercourses no longer show themselves in detail, only in brief glimmers where the last brightness still rests. The old sites do not ask to be named now. They are only rises in the land, places where people once lived close together and made walls and hymns and lists of kings and stories about first waters and far gods, and where the earth has kept the shape of that living after the voices themselves have gone quiet. Above the plain, the sky opens further, and the first stars become easier to see. One appears, then another, and then a few more in places the eye did not notice at first, until the whole dark has begun to gather them into itself. They are the same stars that stood above the reed roofs and temple courts of Sumer, above Akkadian roads and Babylonian processions, above the late rooms at Nineveh where tablets sat on shelves in their ordered rows. They have looked down on fields newly watered, on walls newly built, on kings naming themselves in brick, on scribes leaning over clay while the oil lamp burned low, and now they stand again in the same patient arrangement, meeting nothing from the land below. The night deepens without becoming heavy. It is only night, and the old plain beneath it is only earth and water and distance, and that simplicity is enough. The stories remain where they have been placed, in clay, in translation, in memory, in the slow continuance of names. But the sky above them has no need to hold them tightly. It holds them the way it holds everything, by remaining wide and quiet and present, while human things pass below it and settle into their own forms of rest. And then the distance begins to soften in another direction, not farther out now, but nearer. The stars remain where they are, but the mind no longer needs to follow them across the plain. The old cities can remain where they have always remained, under dark and under time, while attention drifts back toward a smaller room, a nearer darkness, a gentler kind of enclosure. The broad land gives way to the shape of a wall not seen but felt, the outline of a bed, the familiar stillness of late night where everything important has already been set down. In that room, the dark is complete and restful and asks nothing more to be understood. There is the weight of stillness that belongs to a place where everyone is asleep, or nearly asleep, and the air has settled into its quietest form. Nothing in particular sounds. There is no single noise to follow, only the soft presence of a room that has stopped expecting movement. The body has already found the position it means to keep, and the effort of holding it has disappeared without notice. The pillow is slightly cool against the cheek. The blanket has its own steady weight. One shoulder rests more deeply than it did a few moments ago, and then the other does too, until the whole body seems to have agreed at last with the surface beneath it. Breath comes and goes without needing to be counted. The room remains dark and complete, and unconcerned with anything beyond itself. The tablets remember what they were given to remember. The stars remain where they have always remained. The plain lies quiet under night, and here in the small and ordinary shelter of a resting room, there is nothing more to carry. Only the coolness of the pillow in the dark, the sound of nothing particular, and the gentle, unhurried weight of rest. The journey is complete. Rest well.